Welcome, dear friend, to this quiet corner of evening, where the world softens into shadow and whisper, where mysteries unfold not with thunder, but with the gentle turning of pages in candlelight. Tonight, we gather here in this peaceful space to journey together through a tale of intrigue and wonder, set in the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where the incomparable Sherlock Holmes awaits us beside his crackling fire. This story has been crafted specifically for you, to slow your racing thoughts, to ease the tensions of the day, to guide you gently toward that peaceful shore of sleep, where consciousness blurs into dream. Before we begin, I wonder, where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're nestled beneath blankets in a room far from Baker Street, or maybe you're watching the rain against your own window as we prepare to watch it fall upon those famous lodgings. Wherever you find yourself this evening, know that you're welcome here, in this tranquil space we're creating together. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The December rain fell upon London with the persistence of memory itself, each droplet whispering against the window panes of 221B Baker Street, with a rhythm that invited contemplation rather than melancholy. Inside those celebrated rooms, the fireplace breathed warmth into the air, its amber light dancing across the walls in patterns that shifted like thoughts half-formed, casting the familiar furniture into relief. The violin resting upon its stand, the chemistry apparatus gleaming dimly in the corner, the Persian slipper hanging from the mantelpiece with its curious cargo of tobacco. I sat in my customary chair, the leather worn smooth by years of evening vigils, a cup of Mrs. Hudson's excellent tea cooling slowly upon the side table, sending tendrils of steam curling upward into the lamplight. Across from me, Sherlock Holmes occupied his own chair with that peculiar stillness he possessed when deep in thought, his long fingers steepled beneath his sharp chin, his grey eyes distant as though viewing scenes invisible to ordinary perception. The calendar upon the wall marked December the 1st, though the date itself seemed less significant than the quality of the evening. That particular hush that descends upon the world when winter truly arrives, when the year begins its slow exhale toward dormancy. Outside, the city's usual cacophony had softened to a murmur, the clatter of hansom cabs muffled by the steady rainfall, the cries of street vendors replaced by the occasional lonely whistle of a constable making his rounds. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice barely louder than the crackling fire, "do you believe in curses?" The question emerged from our companionable silence, like a fish rising in still water, creating ripples that spread through my comfortable lethargy. I considered my response carefully, knowing that Holmes rarely asked such questions without purpose, though his purpose often remained obscure until he chose to illuminate it. "I believe," I replied slowly, lifting my teacup and finding its warmth pleasant against my palms, "that I have seen enough of the world's genuine mysteries to remain cautious about dismissing anything entirely. Yet I also believe that you, Holmes, would not pose such a question unless you had recently encountered something that warranted philosophical consideration." A smile flickered across his aquiline features, there and gone like moonlight through clouds. "You observe well, my dear fellow. Indeed, I have received a most peculiar communication this afternoon, delivered by a messenger who appeared more frightened than cold, despite the bitter weather through which he had travelled." Holmes reached toward the nearby occasional table, his fingers selecting an envelope from among the organized chaos of his correspondence. The paper I noticed as he held it toward the firelight, possessed an unusual texture, thick and cream-coloured, with a faint watermark that spoke of quality and age. The handwriting upon its face seemed elegant, yet urgent. The letters formed with care, but pressed deeply into the paper, as though the writer's hand had trembled. The letter comes from a Lady Marguerite Ashworth, Holmes continued, his voice settling into that measured cadence he adopted when presenting a case. Widow of the late Sir Edmund Ashworth, collector of antiquities and scholar of medieval history. She writes from Ashworth Manor in the countryside of Kent, a journey of some 3 hours by train. Her concern involves an advent calendar. I must confess that I nearly smiled at this revelation, for the notion of Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective to whom the crowned heads of Europe turned in their darkest hours, being consulted regarding a seasonal decoration seemed almost whimsical. Yet I had learned long ago that the smallest matters often concealed the deepest mysteries, and Holmes's expression remained grave. An advent calendar, I repeated softly, encouraging him to continue while I settled more deeply into my chair, the leather sighing beneath me with familiar comfort. Not merely an advent calendar, Watson, but one that her late husband acquired during his final expedition to the Austrian Alps some 5 years ago. According to Lady Ashworth's account, Sir Edmund discovered the calendar in the ruins of a medieval monastery, dedicated to an obscure saint, whose name has been lost to ecclesiastical records. The calendar itself dates, she believes, from the 15th century, a remarkable artifact, fashioned from dark wood and decorated with intricate carvings of angels and animals, intertwined in patterns that suggest both Christian symbolism and older, more enigmatic traditions. The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and I found myself leaning forward slightly, drawn into the narrative despite its seemingly innocent subject matter. Holmes continued, his voice maintaining that steady, hypnotic quality that made listening to his expositions such a pleasure. The calendar contains 24 small doors, as one would expect, each designed to be opened upon the corresponding day of December, leading to Christmas Eve. Behind each door, Sir Edmund discovered not the usual religious imagery or seasonal scenes, but rather small scrolls of parchment, each bearing a single line of text written in medieval Latin. He spent years attempting to decipher the complete message, believing it to be either a prayer or perhaps a historical record of the monastery's final days. Outside, the rain intensified momentarily, drumming against the windows with renewed vigour before subsiding again into its previous whisper. Somewhere in the building below, Mrs. Hudson moved about her evening tasks, the faint sounds of domesticity reaching us like echoes from another world entirely. Sir Edmund died 4 years ago, quite suddenly, of an apparent heart failure, Holmes said, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. The calendar remained in the family's possession, displayed in the library of Ashworth Manor, but never again opened. Until this year, Lady Ashworth's son, young Marcus Ashworth, recently returned from his studies at Cambridge, discovered the calendar, and, in a spirit of seasonal enthusiasm, opened the first door on December the 1st, which is to say, this very morning. Holmes paused, and in that pause, the atmosphere of the room seemed to thicken slightly, as though the very air had become more substantial. I took another sip of tea, now lukewarm, and waited for the revelation I sensed approaching. Behind the first door, Holmes continued quietly, Young Marcus found not the original parchment scroll, but rather a piece of modern paper, bearing a message written in English, in fresh ink, apparently placed there within the last few days. The message read, "The curse awakens with each door opened. Your father knew this truth too late. Stop now, or join him in the darkness beyond." A log shifted in the fireplace, settling deeper into the grate, with a sound like a sigh, and shadows rearranged themselves across the walls. The rain continued its patient percussion against the windows, and the clock upon the mantelpiece ticked steadily onward, marking moments that suddenly seemed weighted with new significance. "Lady Ashworth wishes us to come to Ashworth Manor immediately," Holmes concluded, lowering the letter to his lap. "She fears for her son's safety, yet she is also deeply curious about the message's origin and meaning. The house has been locked throughout the autumn, occupied only by the family and their small staff of long-time servants, all of whom she trusts implicitly. No stranger could have entered the house undetected, and yet someone clearly accessed the calendar and left this threatening message." I set down my teacup with deliberate care, the porcelain meeting the saucer with a soft clink that seemed unnaturally loud in the contemplative quiet that had settled between us. My mind, which had been drifting toward the pleasant fog of pre-sleep relaxation, now engaged with the puzzle Holmes had presented, though I found the engagement strangely peaceful rather than agitating, as though the mystery itself possessed a quality that invited contemplation rather than anxiety. "When do we depart?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Holmes rose from his chair with fluid grace, moving toward the window where he stood looking out at the rain-soaked street below, his silhouette outlined by the gaslight filtering through the curtains. "Lady Ashworth has arranged for us to take the morning train to Kent. We shall arrive by noon, investigate throughout the afternoon and evening, and likely remain overnight as her guests. I suggest we both rest well tonight, Watson. Tomorrow may bring revelations that require our complete attention." I nodded, rising from my own chair with the pleasant stiffness that comes from sitting too long in warmth and comfort. "Then I shall retire and attempt to sleep, though I confess my mind will likely puzzle over this advent calendar mystery until dawn." Holmes turned from the window, and his smile held both affection and understanding. "Dreams often solve what waking logic cannot, my friend. Let your mind wander where it will. The morning shall bring clarity enough." Sleep, when it came, arrived gently, carrying with it fragmentary images of snow-covered Alps and ancient cloisters, of monks illuminating manuscripts by candlelight, and of advent calendars whose tiny doors opened not onto paper, but onto windows into other times, other worlds, other mysteries, waiting patiently to be understood. Morning arrived with the tentative light of December, pale and uncertain, filtering through London's persistent clouds like hope filtering through doubt. I woke to the sounds of the city stirring itself into motion, the rattle of delivery carts, the calls of vendors, the general murmur of metropolitan life beginning another day. Yet these sounds seemed muted, as though the world itself had chosen to speak more softly, more gently, in deference to the season's contemplative mood. Mrs. Hudson had prepared an excellent breakfast, and Holmes and I ate together in companionable near silence, the morning papers spread before us, though neither of us paid them much attention. My friend seemed preoccupied, but not troubled. His sharp features settled into an expression of pleasant anticipation, like a musician preparing to perform a familiar but beloved composition. Our bags had been packed the previous evening, Holmes with his usual efficiency, I with my old military precision, and by 9:30 we stood upon the platform at Charing Cross Station, waiting for the Kent-bound train that would carry us into the countryside and toward the mystery of Ashworth Manor. The station bustled with morning travellers, their breath visible in the cold air, their footsteps echoing beneath the vast iron and glass canopy overhead. The locomotives hissed and sighed like great sleeping beasts, releasing clouds of steam that rose toward the vaulted ceiling and dissipated like departing spirits. The smell of coal smoke mingled with the scent of strong tea from the station cafe, creating an aroma uniquely belonging to these liminal spaces where journeys begin and end. Our train arrived precisely on schedule, and we secured a first-class compartment that offered privacy and comfort for the journey ahead. As the locomotive lurched into motion, pulling away from the platform with gathering speed, I settled into the cushioned seat near the window and watched as London gradually gave way to suburbs, and suburbs in turn yielded to the countryside proper. The landscape unfolded like a story being told in whispers, bare trees standing in silent witness beside frozen fields, small villages appearing and disappearing with dreamlike brevity, church spires pointing toward the grey sky like prayers made architectural. The rain had ceased during the night, leaving the world washed clean and glistening, every surface reflecting what little light the clouds permitted through. Holmes sat across from me, his eyes turned toward the passing scenery, though I suspected he saw little of it, his mind instead arranging and rearranging the few facts we possessed, building structures of possibility from the scanty materials of Lady Ashworth's letter. Occasionally, he would murmur something too quiet for me to hear, speaking to himself in that way he had when particularly absorbed in a problem. The train carried us southward and eastward, through the heart of Kent's rolling countryside, past orchards standing skeletal against the winter sky, their branches reaching upward like supplicating hands. We passed through market towns whose names I glimpsed on station signs, Sevenoaks, Tunbridge, smaller places whose identities blurred together in the pleasant monotony of travel. At some point, a conductor passed through our compartment, checking our tickets with perfunctory efficiency before moving on, leaving us once again in our cocoon of contemplation. Holmes stirred slightly, reaching into his coat to withdraw his pipe, which he proceeded to fill with tobacco from his leather pouch, the familiar ritual performed with such practiced grace that it seemed almost meditative. "You are wondering," he said without preamble, his voice soft enough that it barely disturbed the train's rhythmic accompaniment, whether we journey toward genuine supernatural phenomena or toward a more mundane explanation dressed in mysterious garments. I smiled, unsurprised by his accurate reading of my thoughts. "I confess that I am indeed considering that very question. Your own skepticism regarding the supernatural is well documented, Holmes. And yet, I have stood beside you in situations that defied easy categorization." He lit his pipe with a match that flared briefly before settling into a steady glow, the smoke rising toward the compartment's ceiling in lazy spirals. "I maintain that the universe, Watson, operates according to laws that, while perhaps not fully understood, are nonetheless consistent and discoverable through careful observation and logical deduction. What appears supernatural often proves merely to be natural phenomena viewed through the distorting lens of ignorance or fear. And yet," I countered gently, "you must admit that not every mystery we have encountered has yielded to purely rational explanation, or, at least, not immediately. Holmes drew upon his pipe, the tobacco glowing orange in its bowl, and regarded me with an expression that might have been amusement or approval or simply acknowledgement. I admit nothing of the kind, my dear fellow, but I do concede that some explanations require more extensive investigation than others. This matter of the Advent calendar interests me precisely because it presents several puzzling contradictions. A medieval artifact supposedly containing a curse, yet the threatening message appears in modern English, written with contemporary ink. A locked house, occupied by trusted servants, yet someone gains access to the calendar undetected. A son who opens the first door on the appropriate day, as though drawn to do so by impulse or tradition, despite the calendar having remained closed for years. The train entered a stretch of woodland, the bare branches creating intricate patterns against the pale sky, and for a moment the light inside our compartment dimmed, as though we travelled through a tunnel of organic architecture. When we emerged again into open fields, the quality of the daylight had shifted slightly, becoming more diffuse, suggesting that afternoon approached, though the morning had not yet fully expired. Perhaps, I suggested, the curse, if we may call it that, operates through suggestion rather than supernatural agency. Young Marcus discovers the calendar, opens the first door expecting seasonal cheer, and finds instead a message designed to provoke exactly the fear and uncertainty we now observe. The psychology of the matter might prove more significant than any metaphysical considerations. Holmes nodded slowly, smoke wreathing his head like mist around a mountaintop. An excellent hypothesis, Watson. You have learned well from our years of association. Yes, the power of suggestion should never be underestimated, particularly when applied to subjects already primed by family history and tragic loss. Young Marcus knows that his father died shortly after acquiring the calendar. He knows that his father spent years attempting to decipher its contents. The calendar itself becomes, in his mind, an object of significance, perhaps even of dread. Then he opens the first door and finds his fears apparently confirmed. The train began to slow, and through the window I glimpsed the first signs of our destination, a small country station, its platform empty save for a single porter standing beneath the shelter of the wooden awning, his breath visible in the cold air. Beyond the station, I could see a village nestled into a fold of the landscape, its houses clustered around a Norman church, whose square tower dominated the modest skyline. We gathered our belongings as the train eased to a complete stop, the brakes sighing like a creature settling into rest. Stepping onto the platform, I was immediately struck by the quality of the silence here. Not the absolute silence of true wilderness, but rather the quiet of a place where human activity occurred at a gentler, more measured pace than in the city we had left behind. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, with an underlying hint of evergreen from the surrounding woodlands. A carriage awaited us, arranged by Lady Ashworth, according to Holmes's telegram of the previous evening. The driver, a weathered man of perhaps 50 years, touched his cap in greeting and saw to the loading of our bags with efficient movements that spoke of long practice. The horses stood patient in their harness, their breath steaming in the cold air, their dark eyes calm and intelligent. As we settled into the carriage and began the final leg of our journey to Ashworth Manor, I felt a pleasant sense of anticipation mixed with that peculiar tranquility that often accompanies travel through beautiful countryside. The lanes we followed wound through the landscape rather than cutting across it, respecting the terrain's natural contours, lined with hedgerows that would be thick and green in summer, but now stood bare, their complex architecture of branch and twig revealed by winter's honesty. The driver said little, though when Holmes inquired about Ashworth Manor, the man replied that it was a fine old house, well maintained, and that the Ashworth family had always been good to the village folk, providing employment and patronage to local businesses. Of Sir Edmund's death, he would say only that it had been sudden and tragic, a loss felt throughout the community. The manor, when it finally came into view, presented itself gradually, emerging from its wooded setting like something growing naturally from the landscape, rather than imposed upon it. Built of local stone that had weathered to a pleasing grey, the house spoke of centuries rather than mere decades, its architecture a harmonious blend of Tudor and earlier medieval elements, with later additions integrated so skillfully that the whole appeared organic, evolved, complete. The carriage followed a curving drive through grounds that, even in their winter dormancy, suggested careful attention and aesthetic consideration. Bare rose gardens surrounded by low hedges waited for spring's resurrection. Ancient oaks stood sentinel at strategic points, their massive trunks testifying to ages past, their branches spreading wide against the grey sky. We came to a halt before the main entrance, where broad stone steps ascended to a heavy oak door fitted with iron hinges that looked original to the house's construction. Before we could knock, the door swung inward, revealing a butler of the old school, upright, dignified, his expression professionally neutral, but his eyes betraying a hint of relief at our arrival. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, with a small bow, his voice cultured and measured. "Lady Ashworth has been expecting you. Please, come in from the cold." We entered into a hall that managed to be both grand and welcoming, its stone floor softened by ancient carpets, its high ceiling supported by dark wooden beams, its walls hung with portraits of previous Ashworths gazing down at us with expressions ranging from stern to benevolent. A fire blazed in an enormous hearth, filling the space with warmth and the scent of burning apple wood. The butler, who introduced himself as Jeffries, took our coats and indicated that we should follow him. We proceeded through the hall and into a corridor lined with more portraits and occasional tables, bearing flowers that must have been coaxed from a greenhouse, their colours vivid against the stone walls. Our footsteps echoed softly, creating a rhythm that seemed to harmonise with the house's own quiet breathing. The settling of old timbers, the whisper of draughts moving through rooms and passageways, like thoughts moving through a meditative mind. Jeffries brought us at last to a drawing room, where afternoon light, such as it was, filtered through tall windows, overlooking what I surmised must be the manor's south gardens. The room was furnished with comfortable chairs and sofas, upholstered in fabrics of deep, rich colours, burgundy and forest green, and a blue like twilight. More paintings adorned the walls, these depicting landscapes rather than people, scenes of the surrounding countryside rendered with skill and evident affection. A woman rose from one of the chairs as we entered, and I knew immediately that this must be Lady Marguerite Ashworth. She was perhaps 45, possessed of that particular English beauty that improves with age, her features strong and intelligent, her bearing suggesting both grief and resilience. She wore a dress of deep grey that managed to be both mourning appropriate and elegant. Her only jewellery, a simple pendant that caught the light as she moved toward us. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice steady and cultured, tinged with an accent that suggested good breeding and extensive education. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I realize that an advent calendar may seem a trivial matter for someone of your reputation, Mr. Holmes, but I assure you that my concern is genuine, and my son's fear is not fabricated or exaggerated." Holmes took her offered hand and bowed slightly over it, his manner respectful and reassuring. "Lady Ashworth, I have learned that no mystery is trivial if it causes genuine distress. Your letter intrigued me for several reasons, not least because it suggests a puzzle with multiple dimensions: historical, psychological, and perhaps even metaphysical, though I remain skeptical of the latter." She smiled faintly, the expression briefly illuminating her features before fading again into concern. "My late husband would have liked you, Mr. Holmes. Edmund was a great believer in the power of reason, even as he pursued artifacts and histories that others might dismiss as mere superstition or fantasy." "Please," I interjected gently, "do sit down, Lady Ashworth. We have travelled some distance, and would be grateful for the opportunity to hear your account in full, with all the details that perhaps could not be included in written correspondence." She nodded gratefully and returned to her chair, gesturing for us to take seats nearby. Jeffries, who had remained silently near the door, stepped forward to inquire whether we would take tea, an offer we accepted with genuine appreciation. As he withdrew to arrange for refreshments, Lady Ashworth composed herself, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze distant as though viewing scenes from memory. "My husband," she began slowly, her voice taking on the quality of narrative, of testimony, was a passionate scholar, particularly interested in the intersection of medieval Christianity and older pre-Christian traditions. He believed that the Church, in its spread across Europe, did not so much replace earlier beliefs as absorb and transform them, creating hybrid practices and symbols that served both old and new purposes. The door opened quietly, and a maid entered bearing a tea service, the china delicate and patterned with what appeared to be hand-painted roses. She set the tray upon a low table near Lady Ashworth, then withdrew with the same unobtrusive efficiency that seemed characteristic of the household staff. Lady Ashworth poured tea for us with practiced grace, the ritual providing a momentary pause in her narrative, a small island of domestic normalcy in the midst of stranger matters. 5 years ago, she continued, after we had all taken our first sips of the excellent tea, Edmund travelled to Austria in pursuit of information about a particular monastery that he believed had practiced a form of Christianity heavily influenced by local pagan traditions. The monastery had been abandoned for centuries, its ruins remote and difficult to access, high in the Alps where few travellers ventured. Edmund spent 3 weeks exploring the site, photographing what remained of the buildings, cataloguing fragments of manuscripts and artifacts. Outside, a bird called from somewhere in the gardens, its voice clear and pure in the winter air, a reminder that life continued in all its ordinary manifestations, even as we sat discussing curses and mysterious calendars. Lady Ashworth paused to take another sip of tea, and I noticed that her hand trembled slightly, just enough to cause a faint ripple in the cup's contents. "Among the artifacts he recovered," she said, setting down her cup with deliberate care, was the Advent calendar. He found it in what had been the monastery's chapel, partially buried beneath fallen stones, but otherwise remarkably intact. The calendar fascinated him immediately. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the carvings detailed and symbolic. The tiny doors fitted so precisely that they remained functional despite centuries of abandonment. But what truly captured his attention were the parchment scrolls behind each door. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his posture indicating complete attention. His grey eyes focused with that peculiar intensity he brought to matters that genuinely interested him. "Did your husband document the scroll's contents before his death?" Lady Ashworth nodded. "Oh, yes. Edmund was meticulous in his scholarship. He photographed each scroll, transcribed the Latin text, and kept extensive notes on his attempts at translation. The Latin was medieval in form, using some vocabulary and constructions that have fallen out of use, which complicated interpretation. He believed the scrolls, when read in sequence, formed a kind of prayer or ritual instruction, possibly related to winter solstice celebrations that had been Christianized and incorporated into Advent traditions." She rose and crossed to a secretary desk, positioned between two of the tall windows, from which she retrieved a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by handling, its pages thick with that particular texture of quality paper. She brought this back to her chair and held it upon her lap, as though it was something both precious and dangerous. This was Edmund's working journal for that final year, she explained, her fingers tracing the cover's tooled pattern absently. His translations and observations, his theories and questions. After his death, I could not bring myself to read it for some time. When I finally did, I found his notes fascinating but also troubling. Edmund had become convinced that the scrolls contained not merely a prayer, but a warning. Something about the cycle of the year, about doors that should remain closed, about knowledge that carried danger for those who sought it without proper preparation or understanding. The fire crackled in the hearth, and one of the logs collapsed inward with a soft sound like a sigh, sending up a small constellation of sparks that died before reaching the chimney's opening. The afternoon light had begun its slow fade toward evening, that gradual diminishment of winter days when the darkness seems less to fall than to well up from the earth itself. "Your husband's death," Holmes said gently, "occurred suddenly," you wrote. "Can you provide more specific details?" Lady Ashworth's expression grew more drawn, the lines of grief deepening around her eyes and mouth. Edmund had been working in the library, as was his custom in the evenings. He had opened all 24 doors of the calendar the previous December, contrary to tradition, because he was eager to photograph and document all the scrolls at once. That winter he seemed troubled, sleeping poorly, speaking of dreams that disturbed him. On the evening of February 14th, I found him collapsed in the library, the calendar open before him on his desk, his journal fallen to the floor. The doctor determined that his heart had simply stopped. No prior condition, no obvious cause. He was only 47, Watson, vital and healthy until that moment. I set down my teacup and met her gaze with what I hoped was professional compassion. "As a medical man, Lady Ashworth, I must tell you that sudden cardiac failure can indeed strike without warning, particularly in individuals under significant stress. If your husband was sleeping poorly and experiencing disturbing dreams, his health may have been more compromised than outward appearances suggested. She nodded slowly. I have told myself as much many times, Dr. Watson. The rational explanation brings some comfort. And yet, I cannot help but note that Edmund died while studying that calendar, and that his journal's final entries spoke of an increasing conviction that the scrolls contained a genuine warning, not metaphorical, but literal. Something about the danger of disturbing what he called the sealed progression of revelation. An artifact centuries old, acquired from a location with documented connections to unorthodox religious practices. A scholar who opens all its doors at once, disrupting whatever sequence or ritual the calendar was designed to embody. Subsequently, that scholar experiences psychological distress, culminating in sudden death. Then, years later, his son discovers the artifact and follows the traditional practice of opening only one door per day, whereupon he finds a warning message written in modern English and contemporary ink. The narrative suggests either supernatural intervention or a more prosaic explanation involving human agency, motivated by belief in the supernatural. The question becomes, who would plant such a message, and why? Lady Ashworth's face showed a complex mixture of emotions. Hope that Holmes might indeed solve this mystery, fear of what that solution might reveal, and something else. Something harder to define, perhaps a kind of desperate need to understand her husband's death, to find meaning in what had seemed meaninglessly tragic. That is precisely what I hope you can determine, Mr. Holmes, she said quietly. My son Marcus is terrified. He believes that by opening the first door, he has set in motion whatever process his father interrupted, and that he is now in danger of meeting the same fate. Yet, he is also consumed by curiosity, torn between the desire to flee this house and never think of the calendar again, and an almost obsessive need to understand what his father discovered. I should like to meet your son, Holmes said, and to examine both the calendar and your late husband's journal, if you will permit me access to these materials. Of course, Lady Ashworth replied, rising from her chair. Marcus is in his room at present. He has been keeping to himself since opening the first door yesterday morning. As for the calendar and Edmund's papers, they remain in the library where Edmund worked. I have had Jeffries ensure that nothing has been disturbed since yesterday's discovery. Shall I take you there now? We rose and followed her from the drawing room, back into the corridor, where the portraits watched our passage with their painted eyes. The house had grown dimmer as the afternoon waned, and wall-mounted lamps had been lit at intervals, their flames enclosed in glass chimneys, casting a warm, flickering light that created more shadows than it dispelled. Our footsteps echoed softly on the stone floors, and I became increasingly aware of the house's age, of the centuries it had witnessed, of the generations of Ashworths who had walked these same passages, pursuing their own concerns, facing their own mysteries. The library, when we reached it, proved to be a magnificent room, 2 stories tall, with a gallery running around 3 sides at the upper level, accessed by a spiral staircase in one corner. Bookshelves covered every available wall space, filled with volumes that spoke of generations of collecting, of scholarly pursuits passed from father to son, of curiosity that could not be satisfied by any single lifetime's reading. Tall windows, now darkening with the coming evening, looked out onto the gardens, and, beyond them, to woodland silhouetted against the grey sky. A desk stood near one of these windows, its surface covered with papers arranged in careful stacks, and upon the desk, dominating it like an altar's central icon, sat the advent calendar. We approached slowly, Holmes with his characteristic quick, precise movements, I with more measured steps, both of us drawn by curiosity and something else. Perhaps the same quality that made certain objects in museums feel different from their neighbours, as though genuinely old things carried with them an atmosphere, a weight of history that could be felt if not quite defined. The calendar was indeed a remarkable artifact. Fashioned from dark wood, oak, I thought, though aged almost to blackness, it stood perhaps 2 feet tall and 18 inches wide, its surface carved with extraordinary detail, angels and animals intertwined in panels that framed the 24 small doors, each door itself decorated with symbols that might have been Christian or pagan or both, stars and crosses, vines and horns, eyes and hands reaching toward or away from things beyond the frame's edges. The first door stood open, hanging on hinges so small and fine they seemed the work of jewelers rather than carpenters. Through the opening, I could see that the interior space was empty now, though presumably it had once contained both the original parchment scroll and the more recent threatening message. Holmes produced his magnifying glass and bent close to examine the calendar, his attention absolute, his breathing slow and steady. He studied the open door's interior, the other closed doors, the carved surfaces surrounding them, taking his time, missing nothing, building his understanding of the object through meticulous observation. Lady Ashworth had withdrawn to stand near the library's entrance, giving us space to work, her hands clasped before her, her expression one of anxious hope. The room had grown quite dim, and she moved to light additional lamps, their flames bringing warmth to the space, but also creating more of those dancing shadows that seemed almost alive in the periphery of vision. "Watson," Holmes murmured, without looking up from his examination, "observe the wood around this first door. Do you see the faint scraping marks, here and here, where metal has met wood repeatedly? These doors have been opened and closed many times over the centuries, yet the other doors show far less wear. Why might that be?" I leaned closer, peering at the areas he indicated, and indeed saw the fine scratches he had noted. Perhaps the first door was opened more frequently, tested, maybe, or used as a demonstration of the calendar's function. Possible, Holmes agreed, moving his attention to the interior of the small compartment behind the open door. The space is approximately 2 inches deep, 1 inch wide, and 2 inches tall, sufficient for the small scrolls Lady Ashworth described, but also large enough to accommodate the folded modern paper that carried yesterday's warning message. "Lady Ashworth, do you still have that message?" "Yes," she replied, crossing to the desk and opening one of its drawers, from which she withdrew a small envelope. "Marcus brought it to me immediately. I have kept it safe here." She handed the envelope to Holmes, who withdrew from it a piece of paper that had been folded twice to fit behind the calendar's small door. He unfolded it carefully, holding it up to the lamplight to read the message we had already heard repeated. "The curse awakens with each door opened. Your father knew this truth too late. Stop now, or join him in the darkness beyond." The handwriting was neat but unremarkable, formed with a pen rather than a pencil, the ink a common black that might be found in any household. The paper itself was modern, inexpensive, the sort one might purchase at any stationer's. Holmes held it to his nose briefly, then examined its edges, then held it up to the light to check for watermarks or other identifying characteristics. "Standard commercial paper," he announced after his examination. "Available throughout England. The ink is equally common, likely from an ordinary fountain pen. The handwriting attempts to appear ominous, but is actually quite ordinary, formed by an educated hand, someone accustomed to writing regularly and clearly. Note the formation of the capital T in the way the crossbar extends confidently. This is not the hand of someone uncertain or fearful, but rather someone making a deliberate choice to communicate in this manner." He refolded the paper and returned it to its envelope, which he handed back to Lady Ashworth. "I should like to examine Sir Edmund's journal now, if I may." She retrieved the leather-bound volume from where she had left it in the drawing-room and brought it to him. Holmes settled into the chair behind the desk, Sir Edmund's chair, presumably, and opened the journal, beginning to page through it with the speed of someone trained to extract relevant information from dense text. I moved to stand behind him, reading over his shoulder, catching glimpses of Sir Edmund's neat hand, his sketches of the monastery ruins, his transcriptions of the Latin texts from the calendar's scrolls. The journal revealed a methodical mind at work, building understanding through accumulation of detail, testing hypotheses, revising theories as new information emerged. Sir Edmund had indeed been convinced that the scrolls formed a continuous text meant to be read across the Advent season, and his attempts at translation suggested a prayer or ritual formula concerned with the turning of the year, with the death and rebirth of light, with the opening of doors between worlds that occurred at liminal times. "Here," Holmes said, pointing to an entry from late January, just weeks before Sir Edmund's death. "Listen to this. I have made a terrible error. In my enthusiasm, I opened all the doors at once, reading the scrolls out of sequence, treating them as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a ritual to be properly observed. The text warns explicitly that each door must be opened only on its designated day, that the progression cannot be rushed without consequences. I have begun to experience disturbing dreams, sensations of being watched, of doors opening in the darkness, of something patient and ancient waiting for the sequence to complete. I must determine whether these effects are merely psychological, the product of suggestion and my own guilt at violating what the monks clearly considered sacred protocol, or whether something more troubling has been set in motion." The room had grown very quiet as Holmes read, his voice steady, but the words themselves carrying a quality that raised the small hairs on the back of my neck. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the windows now reflected only our own lamplit room back to us, creating the sensation of being isolated, suspended in a bubble of light surrounded by infinite darkness. Holmes turned to the journal's final entries, dated in mid-February. And here, just 3 days before his death, the dreams have intensified. I wake with the conviction that I must complete what I began, that having disrupted the proper sequence, I must now finish the cycle, or remain forever in this state of partial opening, neither here nor there, caught between worlds. Yet, I am also convinced that attempting to complete the ritual now, out of season, and without proper understanding, would be even more dangerous. I find myself paralyzed by uncertainty, able neither to move forward nor return to ignorance. I have hidden the original scrolls, each in a different location throughout the house and grounds, so that no one else might make my mistake. The calendar remains, but it is now merely a shell, a beautiful artifact, emptied of its dangerous contents. Holmes closed the journal slowly, his expression thoughtful, his grey eyes distant. He sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers resting on the journal's closed cover, his mind clearly working through the implications of what we had just read. "Lady Ashworth," he said at last, turning in the chair to face her, "did your husband indeed remove the scrolls from the calendar? Have you found them hidden throughout the house, as he claimed?" She shook her head slowly. "I was not aware of this until I read his journal, months after his death. I have not searched for the scrolls, Mr. Holmes. The thought of disturbing Edmund's final actions seemed inappropriate, disrespectful somehow, and I confess that part of me preferred to leave well enough alone, to let the mystery rest with him. But now," Holmes said gently, "your son has opened the first door and found not an empty compartment, but a new message, suggesting that someone else is aware of the calendar's history and wishes either to frighten Marcus or to warn him of genuine danger. Which interpretation you favour likely depends upon your general worldview, whether you believe in curses and supernatural forces, or whether you believe that human psychology and agency can account for all apparent mysteries." Before Lady Ashworth could respond, we heard footsteps approaching the library, and a moment later a young man appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 22, tall and well-built, with his mother's strong features and his late father's evident intelligence in his dark eyes. His face, however, showed signs of sleeplessness and anxiety, shadows beneath the eyes, a tension around the mouth, an overall air of someone operating under considerable strain. "Mother," he said, his voice rougher than it might normally be, suggesting tears recently shed or forcefully restrained. "Jeffries said that Mr. Holmes had arrived. I thought I should—" He trailed off, his gaze moving past his mother to where Holmes and I stood near the desk, and then, inevitably, to the Advent calendar itself, upon which his eyes fixed with an expression of mingled fascination and dread. "Marcus," Lady Ashworth said warmly, moving to her son and taking his hand. "These are Mr. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. They have come to help us understand what is happening." Marcus nodded slowly, tearing his gaze away from the calendar with what appeared to be genuine effort. "Thank you for coming, gentlemen. I realize this must seem foolish. A grown man frightened by a Christmas decoration. But I cannot shake the conviction that something is terribly wrong, that I have made a mistake by opening that first door, that I am now committed to a course of action whose conclusion I cannot foresee." Holmes stepped forward, his manner calm and reassuring, his voice carrying that quality of quiet authority that I had heard him use countless times with distressed clients. "Mr. Ashworth, there is nothing foolish about being concerned when confronted with apparent threats and mysteries. You opened the calendar in innocent enthusiasm and found instead a message designed to frighten. That is cause for concern, not shame. What I require from you now is a clear account of exactly what occurred yesterday morning. Every detail you can remember, no matter how seemingly insignificant." Marcus nodded and moved further into the room, accepting his mother's gentle guidance toward one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. We all settled into seats, creating a small circle of lamplight and attention, while outside, the full darkness of a December country night pressed against the windows like something physical, something patient. "I arrived home from Cambridge 3 days ago," Marcus began, his hands clasped tightly together in his lap, his knuckles showing white from the pressure. The term had ended, and I planned to spend the Christmas season here with Mother. I had not been in this library since summer, and when I entered yesterday morning to select a book, I noticed the calendar on my father's desk. I remembered it from childhood. Father acquired it when I was 17, and I recall his excitement about the find. But I had never paid it much attention then, being at that age where parental enthusiasms seem somewhat embarrassing. He paused, and his mother reached over to briefly squeeze his hand, a gesture of support and encouragement. Marcus took a breath and continued. Yesterday was December 1st, and I thought it might be pleasant to observe the Advent tradition, to open one door each day as one is meant to do. I thought perhaps it would be a way of feeling connected to Father, of honouring his memory by engaging with something he had found significant. So I approached the desk and examined the calendar more closely. The craftsmanship struck me immediately. It's truly extraordinary work. I found the first door, marked with a small Roman numeral I, and I opened it. He fell silent, his eyes once again drawn to the calendar, and I could see him reliving that moment of discovery, of anticipation transforming into shock and fear. The compartment was not empty, as I had somehow expected it might be. He continued quietly. There was a folded piece of paper inside, and I withdrew it and opened it, expecting perhaps some note my father had left, or a Bible verse appropriate to the season. Instead, I found that message. The curse awakens with each door opened. Your father knew this truth too late. Stop now, or join him in the darkness beyond. I recognized immediately that this was not my father's handwriting, that the paper was modern, that someone had placed this message inside the calendar relatively recently. Did you notice anything else unusual? Holmes asked, his tone conversational, encouraging. Any sounds, any sense of being observed, any changes in the room's atmosphere? Marcus considered this carefully before responding. Now that you mention it, yes, the room felt cold when I entered, colder than it should have been, despite the fire that had been lit earlier. And I had the distinct impression, though I saw nothing to confirm it, that someone had been in this room just before I arrived. A lingering sense of presence, perhaps, or simply my imagination, working on my already heightened emotional state. Holmes rose and began to move about the library, his sharp eyes taking in details, his mind clearly cataloguing and analysing. He examined the windows, checking their latches. He studied the bookshelves, looking behind volumes at random. He investigated the fireplace, peering up the chimney. He paced the perimeter of the room, occasionally stopping to examine a particular spot on the floor or wall, his magnifying glass appearing and disappearing from his pocket as needed. The library has 3 points of entry, he observed, speaking as much to himself as to us. The main door through which we entered, a second door there in the far corner, leading presumably to another corridor, or perhaps directly to the gardens, and the windows, which are latched from within and show no signs of having been forced. The room's isolation on this ground floor corner of the house, surrounded by gardens on 2 sides, would make it relatively easy to observe from outside, particularly at night when lamps are lit and windows become illuminated stages upon which interior scenes are displayed for any observer standing in the darkness beyond. He moved to the window nearest the desk and stood looking out into the darkness, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Someone familiar with the house's layout, with the family's habits, with the history of this calendar and Sir Edmund's research. Such a person could have entered this room at almost any time during the past few months, while the house was largely unoccupied, could have placed the message behind the first door, could have arranged matters so that Marcus would discover it at precisely the moment calculated to cause maximum psychological impact. But who? Lady Ashworth asked, her voice strained with frustration and fear. And why? What possible purpose could such cruelty serve? Holmes turned from the window, and in the lamplight his face looked angular and strange, like a carved figure from some medieval manuscript, all shadows and sharp edges. That, he said quietly, is precisely what we must discover. But first, I think we need to understand more about what Sir Edmund learned from those scrolls, what he believed he had unleashed by opening all the doors at once, and where he might have hidden the original parchments, if indeed he removed them as his journal suggests. The clock upon the library's mantelpiece chimed the hour 8 times, marking the evening's progression, and as if summoned by the sound, Jeffreys appeared at the library door to announce that dinner had been prepared and awaited us in the dining room whenever we wished to partake. We rose, grateful for the interruption, for the opportunity to step away from the intensity of the investigation and attend to more ordinary bodily needs. As we filed from the library, I glanced back at the Advent calendar sitting upon the desk, its carved surface seeming to shift and move in the flickering lamplight, its closed doors concealing whatever secrets or emptiness they contained, its first door hanging open like a mouth frozen in the act of speaking some warning that we had not yet learned to properly hear. Dinner at Ashworth Manor proved to be an elegant affair despite the house's small current occupancy. We gathered in a dining room whose proportions suggested it had been designed for much larger parties, its long table capable of seating perhaps 20 guests, though this evening only the 4 of us occupied one end of it, creating an island of conversation and candlelight in the larger darkness. Conversation during the meal ranged over various topics, carefully avoiding the central concern while simultaneously circling back to it repeatedly, like water flowing around a stone. Lady Ashworth proved to be an engaging conversationalist, well-read and thoughtful, her observations on literature and current affairs revealing an active intellect that had clearly been a good match for her late husband's scholarly nature. Marcus, too, demonstrated the education and curiosity one would expect from a Cambridge student, though his contributions came less frequently, his attention seeming to drift at times, his expression growing distant, as though listening to some sound the rest of us could not hear. Holmes ate sparingly, as was his custom when engaged with a case, and he guided the conversation periodically toward topics relevant to our investigation, without making his purposes obvious. He inquired about Sir Edmund's other research interests, about the family's history in the region, about the house staff and their tenure, gathering information that might later prove significant, building his understanding of the context within which our particular mystery existed. Your husband's interest in the intersection of Christian and pagan traditions, Holmes said during a lull in the conversation, his voice casual, merely curious. Was this a lifelong passion, or did it develop later in his career? Lady Ashworth set down her wineglass thoughtfully, her gaze becoming distant as she accessed memory. Edmund's father was a clergyman, actually, Church of England, traditional in his theology, but with a deep interest in ecclesiastical history. Edmund grew up surrounded by discussions of how Christianity spread through England and Europe, how it encountered and ultimately absorbed many local customs and beliefs. I think that early exposure planted seeds that bore fruit in his later scholarly work. He was particularly fascinated by Advent and Christmas traditions, by how the Church had taken the winter solstice celebrations of various pagan cultures and Christianized them, creating a hybrid that served both theological and social purposes. The Advent calendar itself, I interjected, is a relatively modern tradition, is it not? Certainly not medieval in origin. The commercial paper calendars we know today are indeed modern, Lady Ashworth agreed. But the concept of marking the days of Advent with some form of daily ritual or symbolic act has much older roots. Edmund believed that the calendar he found in Austria represented an earlier, more serious attempt to structure the Advent period as a form of spiritual preparation, perhaps even as a magical or mystical practice that existed in parallel to the Church's official liturgy. Marcus, who had been silent for some minutes, now spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of something I couldn't quite identify. Perhaps anger, perhaps fear, perhaps simply exhaustion. Father believed that the scrolls described a ritual for opening what he called the door between worlds, that supposedly stands ajar during the darkest part of the year. He thought the medieval monks were attempting to Christianize an older pagan practice of communing with the dead, or with spirits, during the winter solstice period. The 24 doors represented stages in a process, each one bringing the practitioner closer to some kind of threshold that would be fully opened on Christmas Eve. Holmes's attention sharpened, his grey eyes focusing on Marcus with increased intensity. Did your father believe that this opening was metaphorical, a spiritual or psychological state? Or did he think something more literal was intended? Marcus's laugh carried no humour whatsoever. That was the question that tormented him during those final weeks, Mr. Holmes. His rational mind insisted that the ritual must be metaphorical, that the monks were creating a symbolic journey toward enlightenment or grace. But his experiences after opening all the doors at once suggested to him that something more tangible might be occurring, that the ritual had genuine effects that could be felt, if not explained, by conventional science. The servants brought the next course, a light dessert of poached pears in wine sauce, and the conversation shifted briefly to less fraught topics. But the question Marcus had raised lingered in my mind, and I suspected in all our minds. What exactly had Sir Edmund experienced during those final weeks? What had he felt, or seen, or sensed that had shaken his rationalist convictions, enough to fill his journal with such troubled speculations? After dinner, we returned to the drawing room where we had first met with Lady Ashworth that afternoon, though the room had been transformed by darkness beyond the windows and by the deeper glow of the evening fire. Brandy was offered and accepted, and we settled into the comfortable chairs with the sense of an evening stretching ahead of us, time in which to think and discuss and gradually approach understanding. Holmes remained standing, however, moving to the fireplace, where he stood, looking into the flames, his profile sharp against their glow, his pipe once again in hand, its smoke rising toward the ceiling in contemplative spirals. "I should like to propose," he said after a long silence, "that we attempt an experiment this evening. With your permission, Lady Ashworth, and with Marcus's consent, I suggest that we open the second door of the Advent calendar tonight, December the 2nd, and observe what, if anything, occurs as a result." The proposal created an immediate tension in the room, palpable as a change in air pressure before a storm. Marcus sat forward in his chair, his hands gripping its arms, his face showing alarm. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice rising slightly, despite his obvious efforts to control it. "Do you understand what you're suggesting? The message specifically warned against opening more doors. My father died after disrupting the proper sequence. How can you possibly think it wise to deliberately continue the process?" Holmes turned from the fire to face Marcus, his expression gentle but his voice firm. "I understand your fear, Marcus. May I call you Marcus? But consider what we know. A message appeared in the first door, placed there by human hands, written with ordinary materials, designed to frighten you away from opening additional doors. Why? If the calendar truly carries a supernatural curse that activates when doors are opened, why would anyone need to reinforce that curse with written threats? The very presence of the message suggests that someone wants you to stop opening doors, not because of any mystical danger, but for some more prosaic reason." "What reason?" Lady Ashworth asked, her voice steady, but her face pale in the firelight. "That is precisely what I hope to discover," Holmes replied. "But I will not proceed without Marcus's full consent. This is his family's property, his inheritance, his decision to make." Marcus sat in silence for a long moment, visibly wrestling with competing impulses. Fear urging caution, curiosity demanding answers, perhaps also a desire to honour his father's memory by completing what Sir Edmund had left unfinished. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Very well," he said quietly. "We shall open the second door, but I insist that we all remain together in the library while doing so. I will not face whatever comes alone." "Nor shall you," I said firmly, speaking for the first time in some minutes. "Holmes and I have faced stranger matters than this, Marcus, and we have always emerged with rational explanations for even the most apparently supernatural phenomena. Whatever we find behind the second door, we shall confront it together, and we shall understand it." Thus resolved, we made our way once more through the corridors of Ashworth Manor, our small procession led by Jeffreys carrying additional lamps, followed by Lady Ashworth and Marcus, with Holmes and I bringing up the rear. The house seemed different at night, its shadows deeper and more active, its sounds more pronounced, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of draughts through ancient cracks, the settling of old timbers speaking in their own language of weight and time. The library welcomed us with its lingering warmth, though the fire had burned down considerably and required Jeffreys's attention to build it up again. Once the room was properly illuminated and heated, the butler withdrew, closing the heavy door behind him, with a sound that seemed to seal us into our own private world, separated from the rest of the house, isolated with our mystery and our determination to solve it. The Advent calendar sat waiting upon the desk, exactly as we had left it, its first door still open, its other doors closed, its carved surface seeming to watch us approach with the patience of something that had waited centuries and could wait centuries more. Holmes examined the calendar again briefly, studying the second door, which was marked with a small Roman numeral 2 and decorated with a carving of a dove carrying an olive branch. The symbolism is traditionally associated with peace and the Holy Spirit, he observed, though in older traditions, doves were also messengers between worlds, carriers of souls. We shall see what message, if any, awaits us behind this particular door. He looked to Marcus, who had moved to stand beside him, the young man's face showing resolution, despite the fear that still shadowed his eyes. "Would you like to open it yourself, or shall I?" Marcus swallowed visibly, then reached toward the calendar with a hand that trembled only slightly. "I shall do it. This is my family's mystery. I should be the one to pursue it." His fingers closed on the small carved door, and for a moment he hesitated, perhaps offering a silent prayer or simply gathering his courage. Then, with a smooth motion, he pulled the door open, its tiny hinges making a faint sound like a whisper or a sigh. We all leaned forward simultaneously, our attention focused on the small compartment that the open door revealed. Inside, visible in the lamplight, lay a folded piece of paper, much like the one from the first door, though perhaps slightly yellowed, slightly older looking. Marcus withdrew the paper with careful fingers and unfolded it while we watched in tense silence. His eyes scanned the message, then widened slightly, and he passed the paper to Holmes without speaking, his expression troubled, but also, I thought, somewhat relieved. Holmes read the message aloud, his voice steady and clear. "The second gate stands open. The first offering must be made. Place beneath the oak where 3 paths meet, before midnight strikes, a token of remembrance for the one who has passed beyond. Only then may the third door be safely opened." It's signed with a symbol, a circle containing a cross, with what appear to be rays or branches extending outward. He held the paper up to the light, examining it as he had the first message. Also modern paper, similar ink, same handwriting as the first message. This confirms that we are dealing with a consistent human author, not with randomly manifesting supernatural communications. More interestingly, this message does not threaten, but rather instructs. It provides specific directions for a specific action, suggesting that our mysterious correspondent wants Marcus to do something particular. "An oak where 3 paths meet," Lady Ashworth said slowly. "That would be the old oak in the south garden, where the main path divides toward the rose garden, the conservatory, and the lake. It's an ancient tree, far older than the house. Edmund used to take his morning walks there. He said it helped him think." "And the token of remembrance?" I asked. "What might that entail?" Marcus had moved to sit in his father's chair behind the desk, his face drawn, but his mind clearly engaged with the puzzle. Something belonging to father, I suppose. Something that represented him, or his interests. But this feels like, I don't know, like we're being manipulated, being drawn into participating in some kind of ritual or performance. "Precisely so," Holmes agreed, beginning to pace the library with his characteristic energy, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. Someone is directing us, step by step, through a process, but toward what end? To genuinely complete Sir Edmund's interrupted ritual, to frighten the family away from the manor, to lure us into some position of vulnerability. The messages themselves provide clues to the author's purpose, but only if we can understand the pattern they're creating. He stopped his pacing and turned to face us all, his expression intense, but controlled. "I propose that we follow the instructions. We shall place a token beneath the oak, perhaps something from Sir Edmund's desk, a book or artifact that represents his scholarly work. We shall do so before midnight, as specified, and we shall observe carefully what, if anything, occurs as a result. Watson will accompany me, while Marcus and Lady Ashworth remain here in the library with the doors locked. If this is a trap of some kind, better that only 2 of us walk into it rather than all 4. Lady Ashworth began to protest, but Holmes raised a hand gently. "I understand your desire to be involved, Lady Ashworth, but please consider the practical aspects. If something should go wrong during our excursion to the Oak, it would be far better to have you and Marcus safe here, able to summon help if needed, rather than all of us potentially compromised. Watson's military training and my own experience with dangerous situations make us the logical choices for this particular task." After some further discussion, Lady Ashworth reluctantly agreed. Marcus selected a small leather notebook from among his father's effects on the desk, one of Sir Edmund's field journals from his Austrian expedition, filled with sketches of the monastery ruins and notes about the calendar's discovery. It seemed an appropriate token, personal and meaningful, without being so precious that its temporary placement outdoors would constitute an unbearable risk. Holmes and I prepared for our excursion, donning our coats against the cold December night, arming ourselves with a lantern and Holmes's revolver, the latter more for psychological comfort than from any real expectation of needing it. But prudence suggested caution. The house's clocks showed 10:30, giving us ample time to reach the Oak, place the journal, and return before the midnight deadline. Jeffries provided us with directions to the south garden and the Oak in question, and, with some concern evident in his usually impassive face, he unlocked the library's garden door to allow our exit. The night beyond the threshold was cold and clear, the earlier clouds having dispersed to reveal a sky strewn with stars, their distant light reflecting off frost that was already beginning to form on the grass and stone pathways. The garden, glimpsed earlier in daylight, revealed entirely different qualities by lantern light and starlight. The bare branches of ornamental trees created intricate shadows against the ground, and the geometrical patterns of the dormant beds became mysterious hieroglyphs whose meanings shifted as our lantern's light moved across them. Our breath steamed in the cold air, and our footsteps crunched softly on the frost-stiffened ground. We followed the main path southward from the library, moving deeper into the garden's designed landscape, and I became increasingly aware of how isolated we had become from the house, its lighted windows now distant and small behind us, its warm interior a separate world from this realm of cold stars and winter silence. "Holmes," I said quietly, my voice seeming unnaturally loud in the stillness, "do you truly believe we're dealing with nothing more than human agency here? No supernatural elements whatsoever?" He glanced at me, his face partially illuminated by the lantern he carried, and I saw what might have been uncertainty flicker across his features before being suppressed by his usual confidence. "I believe, Watson, that we are dealing with something that wishes to appear supernatural, whether it genuinely is or not. The distinction may ultimately prove less significant than we imagine. If someone has created an elaborate scheme to manipulate the Ashworth family through their beliefs and fears regarding this calendar, then that scheme has power regardless of whether any mystical forces are genuinely involved. Fear and belief are themselves forces to be reckoned with, particularly when they concern death and unanswered questions about what lies beyond." We walked in silence for a few more moments, and then, ahead of us, looming against the starlit sky, I saw the oak that must be our destination. It was indeed ancient, its trunk massive and gnarled, its bare branches spreading wide as though embracing the night itself. 3 paths met in the space beneath its canopy, exactly as Lady Ashworth had described, and even in winter's dormancy, I could feel that this place possessed a particular quality, a sense of significance that might be purely atmospheric, or might be something more. "Done," he said at last, rising and brushing frost from his knees. "Now we shall withdraw to a position where we can observe without being obvious, and we shall see whether anyone comes to collect this offering, or whether something else entirely occurs at midnight." We retreated perhaps 50 feet from the oak, positioning ourselves behind a large rhododendron that would provide cover while allowing us a clear view of the tree and the paths meeting beneath it. Holmes extinguished our lantern, and we stood in darkness, our eyes gradually adjusting to the starlight, our ears straining for any sound beyond our own breathing, and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. Time in such circumstances seems to behave strangely, simultaneously rushing forward and standing still. I found myself acutely aware of small details, the way frost reflected starlight in tiny sparkles across the grass, the pattern of branches against the sky, the quality of the silence that was never truly silent, but rather filled with quiet sounds that only became audible when one truly listened. The cold seeped through my coat gradually, and I shifted my weight from foot to foot to maintain circulation, all the while keeping my eyes fixed on the distant oak and the journal lying beneath it. Holmes remained motionless beside me, a quality he had perfected during his investigations. This ability to become almost invisible through sheer stillness, to watch without being noticed watching. I envied that capability, for I have always been more restless, more obviously embodied, less able to fade into the background. The minutes crept toward midnight. Somewhere in the house behind us, a clock must be approaching the hour, but we were too distant to hear its chiming. I found myself counting seconds, estimating the time's passage, wondering what exactly would occur when midnight arrived, if indeed anything would occur at all beyond our own observation and cold and growing sense of anticlimax. Then, precisely when I judged midnight to have arrived, something did happen. The air itself seemed to change, growing heavier, more dense, as though some invisible substance had been poured into the space around us. The temperature dropped perceptibly, not the gradual cooling of a winter night, but a sudden plunge that made my breath catch and my skin prickle with more than mere cold. And around the oak, the shadows seemed to deepen and move, not in response to wind or light, but through some quality of their own, as though darkness itself had become animate. Holmes tensed beside me, and I heard his sharp intake of breath. "Watson," he whispered, "do you see?" But before he could complete the question, a figure emerged from the deeper darkness beyond the oak, moving toward the tree with slow, deliberate steps. The figure appeared to be a man, tall and cloaked, his face obscured by a hood, or by shadows, or by both. He moved with purpose rather than hesitation, as though familiar with the garden even in darkness, and he approached the oak and the journal lying beneath it with the confidence of someone keeping a known appointment. I felt Holmes shift beside me, preparing to move, to confront this midnight visitor, but I placed a restraining hand on his arm. Something about the figure suggested that interrupting him would be unwise, that we should watch and learn before revealing our presence. The figure knelt beneath the oak, exactly where Holmes had knelt earlier, and reached down to pick up the journal. He held it for a moment, turning it over in his hands, as though examining it by touch rather than sight. And then, to my utter astonishment, he opened it and appeared to be reading it, despite the darkness that should have made such reading impossible. He remained thus for perhaps 5 minutes, kneeling beneath the oak, reading the journal or appearing to read it, while Holmes and I watched from our hiding place with barely suppressed tension. Then, carefully, he closed the journal and set it down again, repositioning it slightly, and he rose to his full height. What happened next, I can barely describe with confidence, for it occurred at the very limit of what the starlight allowed us to see, and I cannot be certain whether my eyes accurately reported what they witnessed, or whether expectation and fear combined to create illusions. The figure appeared to raise his arms, his cloak spreading wide like wings, and the darkness around the oak seemed to gather toward him, to flow into him or through him, creating patterns that hurt to observe, geometries that should not exist in 3-dimensional space. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the figure turned and walked back into the deeper darkness beyond the oak, moving away from us toward the woodland that bordered the south garden. Within moments, he had vanished completely, leaving no trace of his presence beyond the journal, which remained where he had replaced it beneath the oak. Holmes and I remained frozen in our position for several minutes after the figure's disappearance, neither of us speaking, both of us processing what we had witnessed. Finally, Holmes stirred and relit our lantern with hands that, I noticed, were not entirely steady. "Come," he said quietly. "Let us examine the journal and then return to the house. We have much to discuss." We emerged from our hiding place and approached the oak cautiously, as though the tree itself might prove dangerous, as though the space beneath its branches had been fundamentally altered by what had occurred there. The journal lay exactly where the figure had placed it, and Holmes picked it up carefully, holding it near the lantern to examine it. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement, or perhaps controlled alarm, "look at this." He opened the journal to a page near the middle, and I saw immediately what had captured his attention. On a page that had been blank earlier, I remembered Marcus showing us the journal, remembered seeing unmarked pages among Sir Edmund's sketches and notes. There now appeared writing, fresh writing, lines of text in a hand I didn't recognize, written in what appeared to be the same medieval Latin that Lady Ashworth had described from the original calendar scrolls. "Someone has written a message," I said unnecessarily, stating the obvious because my mind struggled to process the implications. Not someone, Watson, the figure we observed. He read this journal in complete darkness, found a blank page, and wrote upon it with no visible writing implement, all in the space of 5 minutes. Either we have witnessed something genuinely supernatural, or we have encountered a person with abilities and resources far beyond the ordinary. Holmes closed the journal and looked around at the garden, at the oak, at the paths meeting beneath its ancient branches. "We are not dealing with a simple hoax, Watson. Whatever is occurring here at Ashworth Manor, it involves genuine mystery, genuine power, genuine danger. We must proceed with far greater caution than I had initially anticipated." We made our way back toward the house, moving more quickly now, driven by a shared unspoken desire to be inside, behind locked doors, in light and warmth, rather than in the cold darkness where hooded figures appeared and wrote impossible messages. The house's windows glowed welcomingly ahead, and never had human habitation seemed more precious, more necessary, more urgently desirable. Jeffries must have been watching for us, for the library's garden door opened as we approached, and we hastened inside with relief that I made no effort to conceal. Lady Ashworth and Marcus rose from their chairs as we entered, their faces showing the strain of waiting, of imagining what might be occurring in the garden while they remained behind in safety. "What happened?" Marcus asked urgently. "Did someone come? Did you see anything?" Holmes moved to the fireplace, holding his hands toward the flames, as though seeking warmth that went beyond mere physical cold. "We saw a great deal, Marcus, though I confess I am not yet certain what exactly we witnessed. But first, let us examine this journal together. Something has been added to it during our excursion, something that may provide our next clue in this increasingly complex mystery." We gathered around the desk, and Holmes opened the journal to the page bearing the new writing. The Latin text covered perhaps half the page, the handwriting archaic in style, each letter carefully formed, the whole thing appearing as though it might genuinely have been written centuries ago rather than minutes past. "Can anyone read medieval Latin?" Holmes asked, looking around at our small group. Lady Ashworth stepped forward. "I can attempt it. Edmund taught me a bit of his scholarly languages over the years. Let me see." She bent over the journal, her eyes tracing the lines of text, her lips moving slightly as she worked through the translation. We waited in patient silence, the only sounds in the library, the crackling fire and the ticking clock, both serving as reminders that ordinary time continued, even as we grappled with extraordinary matters. "It appears to be instructions," Lady Ashworth said at last, straightening and meeting our eyes with an expression of mingled confusion and concern. "Or perhaps a continuation of the ritual described in the original scrolls. It says something like, 'The first gate is opened, the offering is accepted, the way becomes clear. The second gate requires not an object, but an action, a choice made freely, a sacrifice willingly given. What was broken must be mended. What was hidden must be revealed. What was lost must be found. Only then may the progression continue safely. Only then may the doors be opened without consequence. Only then may the one who seeks to understand approach the threshold and cross over without being destroyed by what waits beyond." Holmes had moved to stand before the Advent calendar, studying it with an intensity I had rarely seen him apply, even to the most complex puzzles. "What was broken must be mended," he repeated quietly. "What was hidden must be revealed. What was lost must be found. These are riddles, Watson, or perhaps they are literal instructions. Either way, they suggest that the mystery of this calendar is larger than we have yet understood, that it involves not just the artifact itself, but the entire history of the Ashworth family, of Sir Edmund's research, of his death and the aftermath." He turned to face Lady Ashworth and Marcus. "Tell me, is there anything from Sir Edmund's final days that could be described as broken? Any relationship that ruptured? Any object that was damaged? Any aspect of his life or work that was left incomplete or in disarray?" Lady Ashworth and Marcus exchanged glances, and I saw something pass between them, some shared knowledge or shared pain that had not yet been articulated. "Father and I quarrelled," Marcus said finally, his voice low, each word emerging with obvious difficulty. "Shortly before his death, I had come home from university for the weekend, and I found him obsessed with the calendar, sleeping poorly, speaking of dreams and visions. I told him, he was becoming irrational, that his scholarly rigour was slipping, that he needed to step away from this particular project and regain perspective. He responded angrily, said I was too young and too conventionally minded to understand what he had discovered. We exchanged harsh words. I returned to Cambridge without properly reconciling, intending to write him a letter of apology once I had calmed down. Before I could do so, he died. I never had the opportunity to mend what I had broken between us. The confession hung in the air, and I saw tears glinting in Marcus's eyes, years of guilt and regret surfacing in this moment of vulnerability. Lady Ashworth moved to her son's side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder, her own expression showing sympathy and perhaps recognition of similar regrets. So, that which was broken, Holmes said gently, might refer to your relationship with your father, Marcus, and mending it might require what? Some form of communication, perhaps, some action or gesture that represents reconciliation. But how can I reconcile with someone who is dead? Marcus asked, his voice breaking slightly. How can I mend what no longer exists to be mended? Perhaps, I suggested, through the very process we're engaged in now, by honouring your father's work, by seeking to understand what he discovered, by approaching his final project with the respect and seriousness he felt it deserved. That might constitute a form of mending, a way of saying the things you never had the chance to say while he lived. Holmes nodded slowly. And what was hidden must be revealed suggests that we need to find those original scrolls that Sir Edmund claimed to have hidden throughout the house and grounds. If we can locate them, if we can understand what they truly say, when read in proper sequence, we may be able to grasp what Sir Edmund was attempting to accomplish, and what danger he believed he had inadvertently created. But that could take days, Lady Ashworth protested. The manor is large, with dozens of rooms, outbuildings, gardens, woodlands. Edmund could have hidden 24 small scrolls anywhere. We might search for weeks without finding them all. Unless, Holmes said, his eyes brightening with that particular gleam that indicated an emerging theory. Unless Sir Edmund left clues to their locations. He was a scholar, a lover of puzzles and intellectual challenges. I suspect he would not have hidden the scrolls randomly, but rather according to some pattern, some system that would be discoverable by someone with the right knowledge and the right approach. We need to search this library for anything that might serve as a map or guide to the scroll's locations. Thus, we spent the remaining hours until dawn engaged in a systematic search of Sir Edmund's papers, his books, his journals, and correspondence. We worked largely in silence, each of us absorbed in our assigned section of the library, occasionally sharing discoveries that might prove relevant. A sketch of the manor's layout, a list of significant locations on the grounds, a fragment of poem or prayer that seemed to relate to the calendar's themes. As the night progressed, I became aware of how the library transformed in the small hours, how its atmosphere shifted from the merely quiet to the profoundly still, as though the house itself had fallen into deep sleep, and we alone remained waking, pursuing our investigation in this pocket of light and warmth, surrounded by darkness and cold. The fire burned low and was rebuilt. Tea was brought by Jeffries at some point, though I could not have said when. Time became fluid, marked only by the progress of our search and the gradual accumulation of potentially significant materials on the desk beside the Advent calendar. It was Marcus who eventually found what we were seeking, or at least the beginning of it. He discovered, tucked into one of Sir Edmund's journals from 2 years before his death, a piece of paper bearing a hand-drawn map of the manor and its grounds. On this map, 24 locations were marked with small symbols, the same symbols that decorated the doors of the Advent calendar, each one carefully rendered and positioned. "This is it," Holmes said with quiet satisfaction when Marcus brought him the map. "This is Sir Edmund's key to the scroll's locations." He encoded the information visually, using the calendar's own symbols to mark where each scroll was hidden. The first scroll, marked with the symbol from the first door, that simple cross within a circle, is hidden here. He pointed to a location on the map that corresponded to what appeared to be the conservatory. And the second scroll, bearing the dove symbol, would be here in the rose garden. But father removed the scrolls from the calendar more than 4 years ago, Lady Ashworth said. Are they still in these locations? Might he have moved them subsequently? Holmes considered this carefully. We can only proceed on the assumption that he left them where this map indicates. If we find that assumption false, we'll adjust our approach accordingly. But for now, I suggest we attempt to locate at least the first 2 scrolls. If we can find them, if we can read what they say, we'll have taken significant steps toward understanding this mystery. Dawn was beginning to lighten the sky beyond the library's windows, transforming the darkness to grey, then to pale rose and gold. We had worked through the entire night, and I felt the exhaustion of sleeplessness combined with the strange energy that comes from being deeply engaged with a compelling puzzle. My mind felt simultaneously sluggish and hyper-alert, my body tired, but my curiosity undimmed. We decided to rest for a few hours, and then, after breakfast, and with full daylight to aid us, to begin the search for the hidden scrolls. Lady Ashworth and Marcus retired to their rooms, while Holmes and I were shown to guest chambers that Jeffries had prepared for us. Rooms comfortable and well appointed, with windows looking out over the gardens, where so much of our mystery seemed to be centered. I fell asleep almost immediately, despite the morning light, and despite the questions circling in my mind, like birds circling a tower. My sleep was deep, but troubled by fragmentary dreams. Images of Advent calendars with endlessly multiplying doors, of hooded figures writing in books whose pages burst into flame as soon as the writing appeared, of ancient oaks whose roots extended down through the earth into chambers where monks sat illuminating manuscripts that showed not religious scenes, but images of the future, of doors opening and closing, each one revealing darkness rather than light, mystery rather than revelation. I woke near noon to find Holmes already up and dressed, standing at the window, looking out over the gardens, his expression distant and thoughtful. He turned as I stirred, and I saw that he had not shaved, that his appearance showed signs of the demanding night we had passed, but his eyes remained sharp, his bearing alert. I rose and prepared myself for the day, grateful for the wash basin and fresh water that had been left for us, for the ordinary rituals of grooming that helped ground me in the familiar and the real. Which explanation do you favour, Holmes? We made our way downstairs and found breakfast laid out in a morning room that faced east, filled with pale winter sunlight that seemed particularly precious after the long night. Lady Ashworth and Marcus joined us, and we ate together with the strange camaraderie that develops among people who have shared unusual experiences, who have become united in pursuit of common understanding. After breakfast, armed with Sir Edmund's map and with a renewed sense of purpose, we began the search for the hidden scrolls. The first location indicated on the map was indeed the conservatory, a glass structure attached to the manor's east wing, filled even in winter with plants that perfumed the air with their growing, with damp earth and green life existing in defiance of the season. We searched the conservatory methodically, looking behind pots, beneath benches, in the small storage areas where tools and supplies were kept. It was Marcus who finally found the first scroll, tucked into a crevice in the stone wall, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture, exactly where the map had suggested it would be. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small piece of parchment, aged and delicate, covered with the same medieval Latin handwriting that Lady Ashworth had translated from the journal the previous night. She took the scroll gently, her trained eyes scanning the text, and then she began to translate, her voice soft in the conservatory's warm, plant-scented air. On the first day of opening, let the seeker remember that all journeys begin with a single step, that all great works commence with small beginnings, that the longest night is pierced by the first faint glimmer of returning light. Let the seeker place upon the altar of memory that which reminds them of what has been lost, for only by acknowledging loss can we begin to move toward recovery. The first door opens not onto revelation, but onto the path that leads toward revelation, and the path itself is the teaching, the walking itself is the transformation. We stood in silence, absorbing these words, which seemed both profound and somewhat cryptic, more poetry than practical instruction, more meditation than map. Yet there was something in them that resonated, that felt true in some deep way that transcended mere literal meaning. "It's beautiful," Marcus said quietly, "and it sounds exactly like something that would appeal to Father. He always said that the journey mattered more than the destination, that the questions we asked were more important than the answers we found." Holmes had been examining the scroll's physical properties, its age, its condition, the type of parchment and ink used. This is genuinely medieval, no question. The materials, the handwriting, the condition, all support an origin dating to the 15th century, exactly as Sir Edmund believed. So, we are dealing with an authentic historical artifact, not a modern forgery. Whatever else may be uncertain about this situation, the calendar and its scrolls are genuinely what they purport to be. We proceeded then to the second location marked on the map, the rose garden, where the dove-marked door's corresponding scroll should be hidden. The roses stood bare and pruned for winter, their beds mulched against frost, their architecture of thorns and branches creating intricate patterns against the earth. According to the map, the scroll should be hidden near the garden's central fountain, currently drained for winter, its basin dry and lined with leaves that had blown in during autumn storms. We searched around the fountain's base, examining the stonework, looking for any crevice or hollow where a small scroll might be concealed. It was Holmes who found it, tucked beneath a loose stone in the fountain's foundation, wrapped as the first had been in protective oilcloth. This scroll too was authentic, and Lady Ashworth translated it as we stood in the cold December air, our breath steaming, the sun bright but providing little warmth. On the second day of opening, let the seeker understand that peace must be made before progress can continue. That which has been broken between souls must be mended between souls. The dove carries the olive branch, the symbol of peace after flood, of reconciliation after separation. Let the seeker speak the words left unspoken, offer the forgiveness left unoffered, seek the understanding left unsought. Only when the heart is at peace can the mind pursue wisdom without being destroyed by what it discovers. Marcus's face had gone pale as his mother read, and I saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides. "It's speaking directly to me," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "about the quarrel with father, about the things I never said, the apology I never made. How could a medieval scroll know about that? How could it address circumstances that wouldn't exist for centuries after it was written? Perhaps," I suggested gently, "it doesn't address your specific circumstances so much as it describes universal human experiences. The reality that we all leave things unsaid, that relationships rupture and often remain unmended, particularly when death intervenes. The scroll's wisdom applies to you because it applies to all of us, to the common patterns of human regret and longing." Holmes, however, looked troubled rather than satisfied with this explanation. "Watson's interpretation is reasonable, Marcus. And yet, I confess that the specificity of these messages is unsettling. It's as though the scrolls were written with knowledge of who would eventually read them, as though they are responding to particular readers rather than offering general wisdom. Either we are experiencing an extraordinary series of coincidences, or something more peculiar is occurring." We returned to the library to examine the scrolls more carefully and to consider our next steps. The Advent calendar sat upon the desk, its first 2 doors open now, their corresponding scrolls recovered and read. 22 doors remained closed. 22 scrolls remained hidden throughout the manor and its grounds. 22 stages of this mysterious progression awaited completion. "We face a choice," Holmes said, standing before the calendar with his hands clasped behind his back, his posture that of a lecturer addressing students. "We can continue opening doors, recovering scrolls, and following whatever instructions or insights they provide, proceeding day by day through the Advent season toward whatever conclusion this process is designed to reach. Or we can attempt to solve this mystery more directly by locating all the scrolls immediately, reading them out of sequence as Sir Edmund did, and understanding the complete message without following the ritual's specified timing." "But father became ill when he did that," Marcus protested. "His journal made clear that opening all the doors at once created problems, that the sequence was important, that disrupting it carried consequences. His journal recorded his beliefs about what occurred." Holmes corrected gently, "But we must distinguish between Sir Edmund's interpretation of his experiences and the objective facts of what actually happened. He experienced psychological distress and eventually died of heart failure. Whether these events were caused by his disruption of the calendar's sequence, or whether they resulted from other factors, stress, illness, coincidence, remains to be determined." This perspective offered a middle ground between supernatural acceptance and complete skepticism, and I saw it resonate with Holmes, even as he maintained his characteristic caution. "Very well," he said at last. "We shall proceed according to the calendar's design, opening 1 door per day, recovering the corresponding scroll, following whatever guidance it provides. But we do so while maintaining careful observation, documenting everything, looking for patterns and connections that might reveal the human agency I still suspect lies behind at least some of what we're experiencing. Thus, we fell into a rhythm over the following days, a pattern that gave structure to our time at Ashworth Manor, and that gradually began to feel less like investigation and more like participation in something older and deeper than mere mystery solving. Each morning, Marcus would open that day's door of the Advent calendar, sometimes finding it empty, sometimes discovering a modern message, like those from the first days. When messages appeared, they were always instructions or questions, always somehow relevant to his relationship with his father, or to the larger themes the scrolls were developing, themes of loss and recovery, of death and continuation, of the doors between worlds and the courage required to approach them honestly. Each afternoon, using Sir Edmund's map, we would search for that day's corresponding scroll, following the symbols from the calendar to locations throughout the manor and its grounds. The scrolls were always where the map indicated, always perfectly preserved, always bearing texts that Lady Ashworth would translate for us, texts that proved increasingly profound as the sequence progressed. The third scroll spoke of sacrifice and what it meant to give up something precious in service of greater understanding. The fourth addressed the relationship between knowledge and responsibility, asking whether the seeker truly wished to know what lay beyond ordinary perception, whether they understood that some knowledge could never be unknown once acquired. The fifth scroll described the monastery itself, the monks who had created this calendar, their belief that the darkest time of year created special conditions, when the boundaries between life and death, between the mundane and the sacred, grew thin enough to be deliberately crossed by those with courage and proper preparation. Each scroll built upon the previous ones, creating a cumulative teaching, a gradual progression towards something that remained undefined, but that increasingly felt significant, weighty, worth whatever effort and risk it demanded. And each evening, we would gather in the library to discuss what we had discovered, to share observations and theories, to build our collective understanding of what the calendar represented and what Sir Edmund had been attempting to accomplish before his death interrupted his work. I watched Marcus transform during these days, watched the initial fear gradually give way to genuine engagement with his father's final project. He began to speak of Sir Edmund not with the guilt and regret that had coloured his early references, but with growing appreciation for his father's intellectual courage, his willingness to pursue questions that others dismissed, his dedication to understanding rather than simply cataloguing mysteries. "I think I understand now," Marcus said one evening as we sat before the library fire, the day's discoveries discussed and documented, the next day's door yet to be opened. Father wasn't being irrational or careless. He was approaching the calendar with the same rigorous curiosity he brought to all his scholarly work. He believed that medieval people understood certain things about consciousness and reality that we've forgotten or dismissed as superstition. He was trying to recover that understanding, to test it, to see whether the monks' rituals actually produced the effects they claimed. Holmes, who had been smoking his pipe in contemplative silence, now stirred and addressed Marcus directly. "And do you believe, Marcus, that your father succeeded? Do you believe he actually opened some kind of door between worlds? That he made contact with something beyond ordinary reality, and that this contact ultimately killed him?" Marcus considered the question carefully before responding. I believe that Father experienced something profound during those final weeks. Whether it was contact with an objective supernatural reality, or a psychological and spiritual transformation that affected him so deeply it compromised his physical health, I cannot say. Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter as much as we think it does. If consciousness and reality are more interconnected than our usual materialist assumptions allow, then opening doors in the mind might indeed open doors in the world, and vice versa. By the time we reached December 10th, we had recovered 10 scrolls and read their accumulated wisdom. The picture they painted was of a systematic process designed to prepare someone psychologically and spiritually for an encounter with what the monks called the threshold, a state of consciousness, or a place, or perhaps both, where the living could temporarily cross into the realm of the dead, could communicate with those who had passed beyond, could glimpse the larger patterns of existence that ordinary perception kept hidden. It's a manual for mystical experience, Lady Ashworth said, as we reviewed the scrolls we had gathered thus far, laying them out in sequence on the library table, their ancient parchment glowing softly in the lamplight. The monks were creating a structured approach to what other traditions might call enlightenment, or gnosis, or divine union. They were using the Advent season's natural symbolism, the return of light, the approach of Christmas, with its celebration of divine incarnation, as a framework for this deeper work. Holmes remained skeptical, but increasingly intrigued. If we accept this interpretation, he said, pacing before the fireplace with his usual restless energy, then Sir Edmund's mistake was not in opening all the doors at once, but in attempting to undertake this process without the proper preparation that the sequential, gradual progression was designed to provide. He tried to sprint to the destination rather than walking the path, and the result was psychological and spiritual whiplash that his system couldn't handle. Marcus had been quiet during this exchange, and I saw that he looked both determined and apprehensive, committed to seeing this through, but uncertain about what lay ahead. On December 11th, a shift occurred. Marcus opened that day's door to find not a message, but a small object, an iron key, old and elaborate, its head decorated with the same symbols that adorned the calendar's carved surface. With the key came a note in the now familiar modern handwriting. The 13th door cannot be opened with wooden hinges. The key you now hold opens the lock you have not yet found. Seek the foundation of beginnings, where first stones were laid and first prayers spoken. There, the hidden will be revealed. Holmes examined the key with intense interest, his magnifying glass revealing details of its construction. This is genuinely medieval, like the calendar itself. It's been hidden behind that door for centuries, waiting for someone to find it and use it for its intended purpose. The question is, what lock does it fit? The foundation of beginnings, Lady Ashworth mused, where first stones were laid and first prayers spoken. That would be the manor's original chapel, I think. The house was built around a small Norman chapel that dates to the 12th century. It's no longer used for services, hasn't been for decades, but it remains structurally intact, preserved as a historical feature of the house. She led us through corridors we had not previously explored, deeper into the manor's oldest section, where the architecture became simpler, more austere, the stone walls thicker and bearing the marks of medieval masons. We descended a few steps into a small chamber that could only be the chapel she had described. A space perhaps 20 feet long and 12 feet wide, with a vaulted stone ceiling and narrow windows that admitted only dim light. A simple stone altar stood at one end, and the walls bore faint traces of what might once have been painted frescoes, now faded almost to invisibility. Holmes examined the chapel carefully, running his hands over the walls, inspecting the altar, studying the floor's stone flagstones. It was Marcus who noticed the anomaly. One section of wall behind the altar, where a locked wooden door was set into the stone, its hinges ancient iron, its lock awaiting the key we had found. "This must be it," Marcus said, his voice echoing slightly in the chapel's acoustic space. "This door must lead to something Father wanted us to find, something he was preparing us to discover through this entire process." Holmes took the key and fitted it into the lock, and it turned with surprising smoothness, despite centuries of disuse, the mechanism still functional, still performing the task for which it had been designed. The door swung inward on hinges that creaked but held, revealing darkness beyond, and the smell that emerged was of old stone and older air, of spaces long closed off from human presence. We lit lanterns and entered carefully, discovering that the door opened onto a narrow staircase descending into the earth, cut through bedrock, leading down into what must be a chamber beneath the chapel, beneath the house's foundation, a space that predated even the Norman construction above. The stairs were steep and uneven, requiring careful navigation, and I felt increasingly aware of the weight of stone above us, of how deep we were travelling into the earth's darkness. The air grew colder as we descended, taking on that particular quality of underground spaces, where temperature remains constant regardless of season, where the earth's own coolness dominates. At the bottom of the stairs, perhaps 20 feet below the chapel floor, we found ourselves in a chamber that took my breath away, despite, or perhaps because of, its simplicity. The room was roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, its walls and ceiling carved directly from the bedrock. Around its perimeter, cut into the stone at waist height, ran a narrow shelf, and upon this shelf sat the remaining scrolls, not hidden individually throughout the manor, as the first 11 had been, but gathered here in this central location, this heart of the mystery. But it was not the scrolls that captured our immediate attention. In the centre of the chamber stood a stone plinth, and upon this plinth sat an object that seemed to glow faintly with its own light, though I knew this must be an illusion created by our lantern's reflection. The object was a box, fashioned from crystal or glass, or some material I couldn't immediately identify, and inside the box, clearly visible through its transparent walls, lay a manuscript, a book, handwritten and illuminated, its pages visible even though the box remained closed. The original ritual text, Holmes breathed, his voice full of wonder despite his usual skepticism. This is what the monks created, what they were preserving with their calendar system. Sir Edmund found this chamber, understood what he had discovered, and then created his entire system of hiding scrolls and leaving clues because he wanted others to find it, but only after proper preparation, only after walking the path he had rushed through recklessly. Lady Ashworth was already moving to examine the scrolls on the shelf, counting them, confirming their presence. They're all here, 13 through 24, exactly as the map suggested. Edmund brought them here, gathered them in this place, but he left us clues to find them, to discover this chamber. So, that we might complete what he began. Marcus approached the crystal box slowly, reverently, his hand reaching out but not quite touching its surface. "The book," he said quietly. "Do we open it? Do we read what's inside? Is that the final step, the ultimate revelation this entire process has been preparing us to receive?" Holmes was examining the box itself, looking for a way to open it, for a lock or latch or seal. There's no obvious mechanism. The box appears to be a single piece of crystal, hollowed to contain the book, with no visible join or opening. Either it's meant to remain sealed, or there's a method of opening it that we haven't yet discovered. I had been studying the chamber's walls, and now I noticed something that the others had not yet observed. Carved into the stone in a spiral pattern that circled the room, descending from ceiling to floor, was text. Latin text. The same medieval Latin we had been encountering in the scrolls. "Look at the walls," I said, directing the lantern light to illuminate the carvings. "There's an inscription here, running around the entire chamber. This might be instructions for opening the box, or an explanation of what we found." Lady Ashworth came to stand beside me, her eyes following the spiral of text, her mind working to translate. "It will take time to read all of this," she said, "but the beginning is clear enough. It says, 'Here lies the threshold work, the culmination of our order's wisdom, the fruit of centuries of prayer and practice, and careful observation. We who write this know that our time is ending, that the forces gathering beyond our walls will soon sweep us away into history's darkness. We preserve this knowledge not for ourselves, but for those who will come after, those who will seek as we have sought, those who will dare to stand at the boundary between worlds and peer into the mystery that lies beyond. The work here preserved is dangerous. It opens doors that cannot easily be closed. It invites contact with presences that do not think as humans think, that exist according to patterns that human minds struggle to comprehend. Those who undertake this work must do so freely, with full understanding of what they risk. The doors of Advent mark the stages of preparation. Each door opened is a step toward the threshold. Each scroll read is a lesson in the wisdom required to stand upon that threshold safely. Rush the process and be destroyed. Approach it properly and be transformed. Choose. The word choose seemed to echo in the underground chamber, though of course it was only our own silence that created that effect, our own heightened awareness making meaning from acoustic accident. We stood in that strange space, beneath the manor, beneath the chapel, in a chamber carved by medieval monks who had known their world was ending, who had preserved their wisdom in ritual form for seekers they would never meet. And I felt the weight of decision, the significance of what we had discovered and what we now faced. "We should bring the scrolls up to the library," Holmes said practically, his voice cutting through the contemplative atmosphere. "We need to read them, to understand the complete teaching before deciding how to proceed with this manuscript box. And we need proper light and warmth to do that reading justice. This chamber has kept its secrets for centuries. They'll keep a few hours more while we work through this systematically." We agreed, and Holmes and I carefully gathered the remaining scrolls from their shelf, placing them in a bag we had brought for transporting whatever we found. The crystal box we left where it stood, its contents tantalizing and mysterious, awaiting whatever next step we would eventually take. Ascending from the chamber felt like rising from water, like breaking through a surface into air and light. By the time we reached the chapel and emerged again into the manor proper, I found myself grateful for the ordinary world, for its familiar textures and comfortable certainties, even as I carried with me the memory of that underground space and its accumulated strangeness. Back in the library, with tea and late afternoon light providing comfort and normalcy, Lady Ashworth began the long process of translating the remaining scrolls while Holmes and Marcus and I listened. The scrolls from 13 through 24 built upon the teachings of the first 12, becoming increasingly specific about the nature of the threshold experience, about what one might encounter there, about the psychological and spiritual preparation required to engage with it safely. They spoke of the veil between worlds thinning during the darkest time of year, of the dead being closer to the living during the winter solstice period, of the possibility of communication between realms if one approached the boundary with proper respect and proper preparation. They described specific practices, meditations, prayers, rituals of purification and dedication, designed to attune the practitioner's consciousness to subtler frequencies, to make perception more sensitive to realities normally invisible, to open inner doors that corresponded to outer ones. And they warned, repeatedly and seriously, that this work was not without danger, that some who attempted to cross the threshold did not return unchanged, that the knowledge gained could be difficult to integrate, that seeing beyond the veil could make ordinary life feel thin and unreal, could create a longing for the other side that became dangerous in its intensity. It's describing exactly what happened to Father, Marcus said as the translation progressed. He opened all the doors at once, experienced the threshold without proper preparation, and the result was psychological trauma that he couldn't recover from. The dreams he mentioned in his journal, the sense of being watched, of something waiting, these were his mind trying to process an experience it wasn't ready for. Holmes nodded slowly, but if that interpretation is correct, then it also suggests that the danger is not supernatural, but psychological. The threshold the monks describe is a state of consciousness, an altered perception, not a literal doorway to another dimension populated by spirits. The presences encountered are projections of the unconscious mind, aspects of one's own psyche that seem other, seem external, because we're not normally aware of them. Does the distinction matter? Lady Ashworth asked. Whether the experience is objectively supernatural or subjectively psychological, its effects are real. Edmund died. The transformation he underwent was profound enough to kill him. We must respect that reality, regardless of how we categorize it philosophically. By the time Lady Ashworth finished translating the last scroll, full darkness had fallen outside the library windows, and we were once again in our bubble of lamplight surrounded by night. The complete teaching of the scrolls, taken together, described a 24-day process of preparation, culminating in what the monks called the threshold crossing, a ritual to be performed on Christmas Eve, the longest night of the year, when the veil between worlds reached its thinnest point. The ritual itself was described in the final scrolls. The practitioner would enter a darkened space, would light 24 candles corresponding to the 24 doors of Advent, would read or recite the collected wisdom from all 24 scrolls, and then would perform a meditation designed to open consciousness to contact with the other side. So, this is what Edmund was building toward, Lady Ashworth said quietly. He wanted to perform this ritual properly, to undergo the threshold crossing with full preparation, but he disrupted the process by opening all the doors at once, and the result destroyed him before he could complete it. "Which leaves us with a question," Holmes said, rising to pace before the fire. "Do we complete what Sir Edmund began? Do we follow the ritual through to its conclusion on Christmas Eve?" Marcus has been opening one door per day, following the prescribed sequence, receiving the preparation the scrolls describe. If the process is indeed psychological rather than supernatural, then he should be able to complete it safely where his father could not. "And if the process is supernatural," I asked, "if there truly is some kind of contact with another realm involved?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Then, Watson, we shall discover that I have been wrong in my skepticism, and the universe contains more mystery than I have been willing to credit. Either way, we shall learn something significant." Marcus had been silent, and now all eyes turned to him. The decision, ultimately, was his to make. This was his inheritance, his father's legacy, his mystery to solve or leave unsolved. "I want to do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was committing to. "I want to complete the process, to undergo the threshold crossing, to discover what Father discovered, but with proper preparation this time. Whether it's a psychological journey or a genuinely supernatural encounter, I need to experience it. I need to understand what he was trying to show me, what he died attempting to accomplish. It's the only way to truly reconcile with him, to mend what was broken between us by showing that I take his work seriously, that I respect what he was seeking." "Then we proceed," Holmes said, his tone both solemn and determined. "We continue opening one door per day, following the ritual sequence exactly. We read and contemplate each day's scroll. We perform the preparatory practices the texts describe, and on Christmas Eve, we descend to that underground chamber. We attempt to open the crystal box if possible, and we facilitate Marcus's threshold crossing experience, whatever that may entail." The days that followed fell into a deep rhythm, a pattern that gradually transformed from investigation into something more like pilgrimage. Marcus continued opening one door each day, though the messages behind the doors became less frequent, as though the unknown correspondent had said what they needed to say in those early warnings and instructions. We retrieved the remaining scrolls from the underground chamber and followed the progression they described, each day reading that day's portion of the teaching, each evening discussing its meanings and implications. Marcus began practicing the meditations the scrolls recommended, sitting in quiet contemplation for increasing periods, reporting experiences of deepening calm, and occasionally of images or sensations that seemed to come from beyond his ordinary consciousness. Holmes occupied himself with attempting to understand the crystal box, examining it carefully whenever we descended to the underground chamber, which we did several times as the solstice approached. He photographed it from every angle, took measurements, tested its hardness and transparency, but found no mechanism for opening it. "It's possible," he said on one such visit, "that the box is not meant to be opened in the conventional sense. Perhaps the point is to encounter the manuscript visually through its transparent container, rather than to physically handle it. Or perhaps opening it requires some specific action that the final scroll will reveal." I spent my time observing and supporting Marcus through his preparation, watching with a physician's eye for signs of the psychological distress that had afflicted his father, but seeing instead a gradual transformation that appeared healthy, a deepening of calm and focus, a settling into purpose that seemed to strengthen rather than undermine him. Lady Ashworth, meanwhile, worked on a complete written translation of all the scrolls, creating a permanent record of the monk's teaching that could be preserved and studied regardless of what occurred on Christmas Eve. Her translation was itself a kind of meditation, a deep engagement with the material that I could see affecting her in subtle ways, softening her grief over her husband's death, allowing her to see it as part of a larger pattern of seeking and sacrifice. The manner itself seemed to settle into the rhythm of our work, as though the house was aware of the significance of what we were attempting. Or perhaps that was merely my imagination, projecting meaning onto the settling of old timbers and the whisper of draughts through stone passages. Yet I could not shake the sense that we were being observed, that our progress was being monitored by something or someone who had a stake in the outcome. The hooded figure from that first night in the garden did not appear again, though Holmes maintained his vigilance, watching the grounds after dark, looking for any sign of human intervention. He found nothing definitive, though occasionally he reported seeing lights in the woodland beyond the gardens, movements that might have been human or might have been animals or tricks of starlight. On December 20th, just 4 days before Christmas Eve, Marcus opened that day's door, to find behind it a scroll unlike the others. Not ancient parchment, but modern paper. Not medieval Latin, but contemporary English. The message was brief. You have walked the path faithfully. You have mended what was broken. You have shown respect for the wisdom preserved. What was hidden has been revealed. What was lost has been found. On the longest night, in the deepest dark, the final door will open. Your father will wait for you on the threshold. Go to him with courage. Complete what he began. Mend the last rupture by crossing where he fell. The message was signed with a name, Edmund Ashworth. The silence that followed Marcus's reading of this message was profound, weighted with implications that none of us wanted to voice. Could Sir Edmund somehow be communicating from beyond death? Or was someone cruelly using his name to manipulate his son? Or was this message from Sir Edmund himself, written before his death in anticipation of exactly these circumstances, hidden away to be found at precisely this moment? It's his handwriting, Lady Ashworth said, her voice barely above a whisper, her hand trembling as she took the papers to examine it. I would know Edmund's hand anywhere. This is written by him. But when? And how did it come to be placed behind this door? Holmes examined the paper and writing closely. The ink is aged, at least 4 years old, if not more. The paper has been folded for some time, showing wear consistent with long storage. This message was written years ago, likely by Sir Edmund shortly before his death, and hidden behind this door to be found at this point in the sequence. He anticipated that if anyone followed the proper progression, they would reach this day and need this message. But how could he know? Marcus asked. How could he predict that I would be the one to find the calendar, that I would open the doors in sequence, that I would reach this point? Perhaps he didn't know specifically, I suggested. Perhaps he wrote the message in hope, preparing for a possibility rather than a certainty. He might have written messages for multiple contingencies, left clues and instructions scattered throughout his research, any of which might be found depending on how events unfolded. Yet, even as I offered this rational explanation, I felt doubt. The message's specificity, its apparent direct address to Marcus, and to our precise circumstances, suggested either extraordinary foresight or something more peculiar, something I hesitated to name. The final days before Christmas Eve passed in a state of heightened awareness and anticipation. Marcus opened the remaining doors, 21, 22, 23, finding them empty, but feeling, he reported, that each opening was itself significant, a step in a progression that was building towards something inevitable, something both desired and feared. We prepared practically as well, gathering candles, ensuring we had proper light sources for the underground chamber, planning our approach to Christmas Eve's ritual with the same attention to detail that Holmes brought to any investigation. Yet, beneath the practical preparations, I felt something else building, a sense of standing on the edge of something vast, of approaching a boundary that once crossed would change everything. Christmas Eve arrived with clear, cold weather, the sky brilliant with stars, the night promising to be the longest and darkest of the year. We gathered after dinner in the library, the Advent calendar before us, with only one door remaining closed. The 24th door, marked with the Roman numeral 22, decorated with a carving of a doorway standing open, light streaming through it into darkness. "It's time," Marcus said, his voice steady, his face calm. "I'm ready. Let us open the final door and discover what it contains." He reached toward the calendar, his hand moving with deliberate care, and he opened the 24th door. Behind it, we found no message, no scroll, no object. Instead, the small compartment appeared empty at first glance. But when Holmes brought a lamp close, we saw that the back wall of the compartment was not wood like the others, but rather a small mirror, its surface reflecting back the lamplight, and, faintly, our own faces peering into the calendar's depths. "The final door opens onto a mirror," Holmes said thoughtfully. "The last threshold is self-reflection, self-knowledge. Whatever lies beyond the veil, whatever one encounters at the boundary between worlds, is ultimately oneself, one's own consciousness experienced from an unfamiliar angle. Or," Lady Ashworth suggested softly, "the mirror represents that we see the other side dimly, through reflection, rather than directly. St. Paul wrote that we see through a glass darkly, that our earthly perception is necessarily indirect, distorted. Perhaps the mirror reminds us of the limitations of our perception, even as we attempt to transcend them. We gathered the materials we would need, the 24 candles, the complete set of translated scrolls, lanterns for the descent into the chamber, blankets and warm clothing for what might be an extended vigil in the cold underground space. As we prepared, I felt we were crossing a threshold of our own, moving from investigation into participation, from solving a mystery into becoming part of it. The manor was quiet as we made our way to the old chapel, its corridors empty, its windows dark. Jeffries and the other staff had been given the evening free, and we were alone in the house, or at least alone with whatever presences might share it with us, visible or invisible. In the chapel, we lit lanterns and descended the narrow stairs into the underground chamber, moving carefully, carrying our materials with us. The chamber welcomed us with its cold stone silence, the crystal box still centered on its plinth, the manuscript inside still visible but unreadable through the translucent walls. We arranged the 24 candles in a circle around the plinth, and Marcus lit them one by one, each flame representing a day of Advent, a stage of preparation, a door opened in sequence. As the flames multiplied, the chamber filled with warm, flickering light that softened the stone walls and made shadows dance like living things. When all 24 candles burned, Marcus positioned himself before the crystal box and began to read aloud from the collected scrolls, speaking the monk's wisdom into the chamber's acoustic space, his voice steady and clear, filled with understanding earned through days of preparation. As Marcus read, I became aware that the temperature in the chamber was dropping, that our breath was becoming visible in the candlelight, that the quality of the air was changing. Yet I felt no fear, only a heightened attentiveness, a sense that reality was becoming more concentrated, more present, more itself. Marcus finished reading the scrolls and fell silent, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and regular. Minutes passed, marked only by the slight guttering of candle flames, by the absolute stillness of the underground chamber. Then, slowly, Marcus opened his eyes and reached toward the crystal box. His hand touched its surface, and the box opened. Not with any mechanical movement, not with hinges or latches, but simply ceased to be closed, its transparent walls becoming insubstantial, allowing Marcus to reach inside and withdraw the manuscript. He opened the book, for it was a book, bound in leather so old it seemed more idea than material, its pages covered with illuminated text and images that glowed in the candlelight as though lit from within. And he began to read, not aloud but silently, his eyes moving across the pages, his expression transforming through wonder and recognition, and finally into something like peace. Time became strange in that chamber. I cannot say whether Marcus read for minutes or hours. I know that I became aware of presences around us, of the chamber feeling more occupied than our physical bodies could account for. I saw, or thought I saw, figures standing in the shadows beyond the candlelight, monks in their robes, their faces gentle and knowing, watching Marcus complete what they had initiated centuries before. And I saw, or thought I saw, another figure standing beside Marcus, a hand resting on his shoulder, Sir Edmund, or the memory of him, or Marcus's need for reconciliation made visible. I cannot say which, and perhaps it doesn't matter. Marcus closed the book finally and looked up, and I saw tears on his face, but also a smile of such genuine peace that I knew, whatever had occurred in this chamber, it had been healing rather than harmful, reconciling rather than rupturing. "Father," he said simply, speaking to the air or to the figure beside him, or to his own heart. "I understand now. Thank you." The candles flickered once, twice, and then began to go out one by one, not from any wind, but simply reaching the natural end of their burning. As the light faded, the chamber returned to ordinary darkness, ordinary cold, ordinary stone. We ascended from that place in silence, carrying with us the manuscript that Marcus had retrieved, carrying also experiences and perceptions that would require time to process, to integrate, to understand. In the chapel above, we found the first light of Christmas morning beginning to illuminate the narrow windows, dawn arriving exactly on schedule, despite the strangeness we had witnessed in the chamber below. Back in the library, with the fire rebuilt and tea prepared, we finally spoke of what we had experienced. Marcus described reading the manuscript, which proved to be not instructions or ritual formulas, but rather a kind of map of consciousness, a description of the territory one enters when crossing the threshold between ordinary perception and expanded awareness. "It showed me," he said, struggling for words adequate to the experience. That death is not ending but transformation. That consciousness continues in forms we don't usually perceive. That Father isn't gone, but rather changed, translated into a different mode of being. And it showed me that the rupture I felt between us existed only in my own guilt, that he had never blamed me for our quarrel, that love persists beyond death and beyond misunderstanding. Holmes, ever the rationalist, attempted to pass the experience into psychological categories: suggestion, expectation, the power of ritual to create altered states of consciousness. Yet, even he admitted that what we had witnessed in that chamber exceeded his usual explanatory frameworks. Perhaps, he said finally, there are more things in heaven and earth than my philosophy has accounted for. Or perhaps the line between psychological and metaphysical is less clear than I have assumed. Either way, I acknowledge that we have encountered genuine mystery here at Ashworth Manor. Mystery that deepens rather than resolves with understanding. Lady Ashworth held her son's hand, her face showing relief and gladness. That Marcus had emerged from his threshold, crossing, transformed but whole, having found the reconciliation with his father that had eluded him for years. We spent Christmas Day quietly at Ashworth Manor, resting and reflecting, allowing the experiences of the previous night to settle into memory and meaning. The calendar sat upon the desk, all its doors now open, its secrets revealed, its purpose fulfilled. Marcus would keep it, he decided, as his inheritance from his father, but he would keep it with understanding now, with respect for what it represented and what it had facilitated. In the days that followed, as Holmes and I prepared to return to London and to the more ordinary mysteries that awaited us there, we discussed what had occurred and what lessons we might draw from it. The figure in the garden, I said to Holmes on one of our final evenings at the manor. The hooded man who took the journal and wrote in it. Do you believe that was a person or something else? Holmes smiled enigmatically. I believe, Watson, that some questions are more valuable than their answers. The moment we definitively categorize something as natural or supernatural, human or other, we limit our understanding of it. Perhaps the mystery itself is the teaching. Perhaps the monks who created this calendar understood that transformation comes not from answers, but from the willingness to stand in uncertainty, to remain open to multiple possibilities, to resist the comfortable closure of premature explanation. It was, I thought, a remarkably un-Holmes-like position, yet it suited the experiences we had shared. We had come to Ashworth Manor expecting to solve a mystery through logic and observation, and we had succeeded in that aim. But we had also encountered something that exceeded solution, that deepened into wonder rather than resolving into explanation. On our final evening, we gathered once more in the library, Holmes, Lady Ashworth, Marcus, and I. The Advent calendar sat before us, and Marcus opened the manuscript we had retrieved from the underground chamber, reading passages aloud, sharing the wisdom the medieval monks had preserved. The manuscript spoke of cycles, how darkness and light chase each other through the year, how death and birth are inseparable aspects of existence, how endings are always also beginnings. It spoke of the necessity of mystery, of how the human spirit requires unknown territories to explore, questions without ready answers, doorways that open onto further doorways, rather than onto final destinations. What will you do now? Holmes asked Marcus. Will you continue your studies at Cambridge? Will you pursue your father's scholarly interests? Marcus considered carefully before responding. I think I will study theology and psychology, looking for the intersections between them. I want to understand what Father was investigating, to bring rigorous scholarly methods to questions about consciousness and transcendence and the boundaries of human experience. Not to explain away the mystery, but to honor it, to approach it with the respect it deserves. As the evening drew toward a close, we sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts about all that had occurred. The clock struck midnight, marking the passage from one day into the next, and I realized that the Advent season had concluded, that we had moved through the threshold into the days that follow Christmas, into the long, slow progression toward spring and renewal. Before we retired for the night, Lady Ashworth gave us gifts. Books from Sir Edmund's collection for Holmes, a medieval manuscript on herbal medicine for me, tokens of appreciation for our assistance and our companionship through this strange journey. You helped my son find his way back to his father, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You helped us understand Edmund's death not as senseless tragedy, but as part of a larger pattern of seeking and discovery. That is a gift beyond measure, and I am grateful. The next morning, Holmes and I departed Ashworth Manor, taking the early train back to London, back to Baker Street, back to the familiar routines of urban life and more conventional mysteries. Yet, I carried with me the memory of what we had experienced, of underground chambers and ancient wisdom, of Advent calendars that opened not just onto paper, but onto transformative experiences, of the profound truth that some doors, once opened, change everything about how we see the world. And so, dear friend, we come to the end of this tale, this story of mystery and wonder, of fathers and sons, of seeking and finding, of doors that open both outward and inward. I hope that it has carried you gently towards sleep, that your thoughts have slowed and softened as we walked together through this narrative, that you have found in these words a kind of peace, a settling into rest. As you drift now towards sleep, let your mind hold lightly these images of candlelight in dark chambers, of ancient manuscripts holding wisdom across centuries, of the patient turning of seasons from darkness toward light. Let yourself feel the comfort of knowing that mysteries exist not to frighten but to invite, that doors we fear to open often lead to exactly what we need to discover, that reconciliation is possible even with those who have passed beyond our ordinary reach. Sleep now, deeply and well, knowing that the longest night has passed, that light returns, that the cycle continues its eternal turning. Sleep with the peace of having completed a journey, of having opened all the doors and finding not destruction, but understanding, not terror, but transformation. If you have enjoyed this story, this gentle journey through Gothic mystery and Victorian contemplation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories crafted to help you sleep, to ease your mind, to carry you softly into dreams. Your support allows these tales to continue, these quiet spaces to exist, where we can gather away from the noise of the world and simply rest together in story and silence. Good night, dear friend. May your sleep be deep and dreamless, or, if dreams come, may they be of open doors and warm firesides, of mysteries solved and reconciliations achieved, of love that persists beyond all the thresholds we must eventually cross. Good night. Rest well. Tomorrow will bring its own light, its own doors, its its own gentle revelations. Sleep now. All is well. Good night.